It's funny, in a way, how entire periods of history end up being named after materials most people never even stop to think about. Stone, bronze, iron. But somewhere along the line, one strange metal started changing things so completely that people built whole worlds around it without really noticing it happening at first. A sharper tool here, a stronger blade there. Trade routes stretching further than they used to. Villages turning into cities a little faster than before. Tonight, we're just going to sit with that for a while. The metal itself, the people working with it, and the slow, almost invisible way it reshaped the ancient world over generations. And like everything here on Made for Sleep, this episode comes together from historical research, archaeological evidence, and the quieter details our team thinks are worth lingering on. So let the rain drift around in the distance. Let the fire do its thing for a bit. And if you're somehow still awake later tonight, feel free to say hello in the comments and mention what time it is where you are. You're about to follow the quiet journey of a material so unusual that ancient people treated it like captured starlight. A substance that arrived cold from the sky, glowed orange under flame, and slowly rewrote the rules of survival across entire continents. This isn't a story of sudden revolution or dramatic invention. It's the patient, textured account of how bronze, meteoric iron, and early experimental alloys move through human hands over thousands of years, transforming workshops, trade routes, ritual practices, and the basic tools that kept civilization running. Tonight you'll drift through dim forges, dusty caravans, and firelit rooms where craftsmen discovered, very gradually, that certain rocks could be convinced to become something else entirely. The first time someone realizes that a particular kind of stone sweats metal when placed in fire, it probably doesn't feel like witnessing history. You're somewhere along the eastern Mediterranean coast, maybe 4,000 years before anyone will bother numbering the years the way we do now. The settlement is small, a cluster of mud brick structures arranged around a central courtyard, where goats complain and children scatter grain for chickens that peck at the dust with mechanical precision. The sea is close enough that you can smell salt on the evening wind, and the ground underfoot is a mixture of pale dust and pottery fragments that crunch softly when you shift your weight. Each piece a reminder of vessels that broke decades ago and never quite disappeared. Someone has built a fire near the edge of the courtyard, not for cooking, but for working. A potter, most likely, though the distinction between potter and metalworker hasn't quite solidified yet because specialisation is still a luxury most settlements can't afford. The fire is hotter than a cooking fire needs to be, fed carefully with dry wood and arranged so the coals glow white at the centre, radiating heat that makes the air shimmer and distorts the view of anything beyond it. And sitting in those coals, almost by accident, is a chunk of greenish stone that someone picked up because it looked interesting. Malachite, though nobody here calls it that. Just a pretty rock with bands of colour running through it like frozen water, like something that might have decorative value if it could be polished properly. You crouch near the fire and watch the stone. It takes a long time for anything to happen. The wood crackles, sending up occasional showers of sparks that rise and die in the space of a breath. Smoke drifts upward in a lazy column, bending when the breeze catches it, carrying the sharp scent of burning wood across the courtyard. The person tending the fire adjusts a few pieces of fuel, nudging the stone deeper into the heat without really thinking about it. Attention divided between the fire and some other task that needs finishing before darkness falls completely. And then, slowly, the stone begins to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the green surface darkens and something inside it starts to glisten. A bead of something that catches the firelight, something that doesn't behave like stone at all. It pools and spreads slightly, moving with a liquid heaviness that seems impossible for something that came from solid rock. The person tending the fire notices and stops what they're doing, crouching closer to see better, using a stick to push other pieces of fuel aside so the strange transformation is more visible. Copper, though again, the person watching doesn't have that word yet. They only know that when the fire cools and they pull the stone out with a stick, carefully because even cooled it retains heat longer than stone should, there's a small puddle of reddish metal clinging to the charcoal, cool enough now to touch, soft enough to dent with a fingernail. It's heavier than it should be for its size, dense in a way that makes it feel significant when you hold it in your palm. It doesn't flake or crack the way stone does when you try to shape it. When you press hard with a rounded pebble, it resists and then yields, bending rather than breaking, leaving a smooth depression that catches the light differently than the surrounding surface. This, right here, is the beginning of something that will take centuries to fully unfold. Because copper by itself isn't particularly impressive when judged by later standards. It's too soft to hold a sharp edge for long. A copper knife will dull quickly if you use it for anything demanding, and a copper axe will bend if you're too enthusiastic about chopping wood or clearing brush. But it's workable, and it's novel, and it doesn't require an enormous leap in technology to produce. You just need a hot fire, the right kind of stone, and enough patience to figure out that if you do this repeatedly, carefully collecting the small beads and droplets of metal, you can accumulate enough to make small tools, ornaments, pins, fish hooks, things that glint attractively in sunlight and don't rust, the way iron eventually will, maintaining their reddish gold luster for years with only occasional polishing. For a while, copper is enough. It spreads slowly along trade routes, carried by people who've learned which stones yield metal and which fires burn hot enough to coax it out. You can track its movement by the small hoards that turn up in archaeological digs, caches of copper objects buried deliberately, possibly as offerings to ensure future prosperity, possibly as emergency savings hidden during times of uncertainty and never reclaimed. The metal is valuable, but not overwhelmingly so. It's useful, but not transformative. Not yet. Stone tools continue to dominate daily work, and bone awls still stitch leather more reliably than early copper needles that bend too easily under pressure. And then someone, probably several someones, working independently in different regions separated by mountains and seas and deserts, never knowing about each other, never able to compare notes, figures out that copper gets more interesting when you mix it with something else. The realization doesn't arrive as a sudden flash of insight accompanied by dramatic declarations. It's more like a slow, puzzled observation that spreads over generations, passed from master to apprentice in workshops where knowledge accumulates like sediment. You notice that some batches of copper are harder than others. Some hold an edge longer. Some have a slightly different colour, a little more golden, a little less red, catching sunlight in a way that seems more substantial somehow. At first, this might seem like natural variation, different stones producing slightly different results depending on where they were mined, or how hot the fire burned, or what phase the moon was in when the smelting happened. But eventually someone realizes that the stronger copper comes from fires where certain other stones were present. Stones that contain tin, specifically, though identifying tin ore is tricky because it doesn't look like much. Cassiterite, tin oxide, is a dark, unassuming mineral that you could easily walk past without noticing, that resembles dozens of other dark stones common in riverbeds and rocky hillsides. It doesn't have the distinctive green colour of malachite or the reddish tint of hematite. It just looks like stone, unremarkable and easy to overlook unless you already know what you're searching for. But when you smelt copper and tin together, something genuinely useful happens. The resulting alloy, bronze, is harder, tougher, and holds an edge far better than pure copper. It's still not as hard as steel will eventually be, centuries in the future, but it's a significant improvement, and for several thousand years it will be the best option available for making tools, weapons, and anything else that needs to be both durable and shapeable. The discovery doesn't spread quickly because knowledge in the ancient world moves at walking pace, carried by traders and travelling craftsmen who share techniques in exchange for hospitality or payment. You're standing now in a slightly larger settlement, maybe a few hundred years later. The architecture has improved, stone foundations providing stability, wooden beams supporting roofs, thatched coverings that keep out most of the rain and provide shade during the hottest parts of the day. There's a dedicated workshop area where a smith works bronze, and the whole process has become more refined, more ritualised, with specific procedures that apprentices learn through years of observation and practice. The furnace is a waist-high structure made of clay mixed with crushed pottery and straw, with an opening at the base for feeding charcoal and a vent at the top where smoke escapes in a steady stream that stains the sky grey. Bellows made from animal hide help push air into the fire, raising the temperature high enough to melt bronze cleanly. The bellows operator works in a steady rhythm, pump, release, maintaining a constant flow of air that makes the coals glow brighter and hotter. The work is monotonous, but requires attention, because if the airflow falters, the temperature drops, and the bronze in the crucible might not melt completely, or might cool before it can be poured properly. The smith is preparing a mould, a flat stone with a shallow depression carved into it, shaped like the blade of a knife. The carving took hours, done with harder stones and metal tools, gradually abrading the softer stone until the depression matched the desired blade shape. The interior of the mould has been dusted with fine ash to keep the metal from sticking, and the stone has been warmed near the fire so the temperature difference won't be too extreme when the molten bronze makes contact. Nearby, in a ceramic crucible sitting in the hottest part of the furnace, bronze is liquefying, glowing orange, then yellow, rippling slightly as impurities rise to the surface and get skimmed off with a charred stick that the smith handles with the casualness of long practice. When the bronze is ready, the smith uses long tongs to lift the crucible and pour the molten metal into the mould. It flows like heavy honey, filling the depression with a faint hissing sound as it meets the cooler stone, releasing a thin wisp of steam where moisture still clings to the mould surface despite the warming. The glow fades quickly, orange to red to dull grey, and within a few minutes the bronze is solid enough to tap out of the mould with a wooden mallet. It's still too hot to handle directly, radiating heat that you can feel from a hand's width away. But you can see the shape clearly now. A knife blade, rough and unfinished, with a pebbled surface from the texture of the mould but recognisable. The finishing work takes longer than the casting. The blade has to be ground smooth on an abrasive stone, the smith working in patient strokes, checking the surface frequently to ensure the grinding is even and doesn't remove too much material from any one spot. Then it needs to be sharpened carefully so the edge tapers without becoming brittle, which requires understanding exactly how thin the edge can be before it becomes prone to chipping. Finally, it gets polished with increasingly fine abrasives until it gleams, catching and reflecting light in a way that makes it look more valuable than it actually is. The whole process, from melting the bronze to completing the knife, might take an entire day if the smith works without major interruptions. And this is just one knife. The smith will make dozens more over the course of a season, along with axe heads, chisels, awls, needles, any small tool that can be improved by upgrading from stone or bone to metal. Bronze changes things, but slowly. It doesn't replace stone tools overnight or render centuries of stoneworking knowledge obsolete. For a long time, both exist side by side, used for different tasks depending on availability and cost and tradition. Bronze is expensive. The copper is fairly common, at least in regions with the right geology, but tin is rare. There are only a few places in the ancient world where tin can be mined in significant quantities: Cornwall in Britain, parts of Iberia, certain regions in Central Asia, and getting it from those places to where it's needed requires extensive trade networks that span hundreds or thousands of miles. You're travelling now, following one of those trade routes. It's a coastal path that winds along cliffs, offering spectacular views of the sea crashing against rocks far below, then dips down to beaches where the walking is easier on flat sand and occasionally cuts inland to avoid particularly rugged terrain, where the cliffs become impassable. The traders are moving in a loose group, maybe a dozen people, along with several donkeys loaded with goods that shift and creak with each step. They're carrying tin ingots, each one shaped like a flat disc about the size of a dinner plate. stamped with marks that indicate origin and weight, symbols that mean nothing to you but communicate precise information to anyone familiar with the system. The ingots are wrapped in leather to protect them from moisture and salt spray, and packed carefully so they don't shift during travel, which could bruise the donkeys or cause the whole load to become unbalanced. Each animal carries a substantial weight, but not so much that it can't manage the terrain or maintain a steady pace over long distances. The donkeys are experienced travellers, picking their way over rocky sections with the confidence of animals that have made this journey many times, that know which footing is reliable and which stones might shift underfoot. The journey is slow. Nobody hurries. Hurrying increases the risk of injury. A twisted ankle, a stumbled donkey, a load that breaks free and tumbles down a slope, and besides, there's no urgent deadline. The tin will reach its destination when it reaches its destination, whether that's in 2 weeks or 3. Along the way, the traders stop at settlements to rest, trade news, and occasionally exchange goods. Sometimes they pick up additional cargo, copper ingots heading in the opposite direction, pottery that's prized in other regions, dried fish, dyed textiles that command high prices in markets where certain colours are difficult to produce locally. Sometimes they leave a few tin ingots behind, traded for food or shelter or other goods they'll need further along the route. At night, the group camps on open ground, building a fire and arranging sleeping mats in a rough circle around it. The firelight pushes back the darkness, creating a small zone of warmth and relative safety, while the larger darkness presses in from all sides. The sound of the sea, if they're near the coast, creates a steady background rhythm, waves breaking and withdrawing, with a regularity that's both soothing and relentless. Conversations are quiet, occasional. Someone tells a story about a previous journey, or a strange thing seen in a distant market, or a piece of local gossip that might be months out of date by the time it reaches its subject but is still worth sharing. The stories aren't dramatic. Mostly they're about ordinary frustrations, difficult roads that became worse after heavy rains, unexpected weather that delayed travel for days, a donkey that refused to cross a stream and had to be coaxed and pushed, while the rest of the group waited with varying degrees of patience. There's humour in the telling, the kind that comes from shared hardship survived and transformed into narrative. One trader describes in elaborate detail the methods tried to convince the stubborn donkey to cross: bribery with food, threats, demonstrations by other donkeys, finally just wading into the stream and pulling while 2 others pushed from behind, all of them ending up soaked and the donkey looking smug. One of the traders unwraps a small bronze knife from a pouch and uses it to slice dried fruit, passing pieces around the fire. The knife is old, worn smooth by years of use, the blade curved slightly from repeated sharpening that has gradually changed its shape but still functional. The handle is wrapped in leather strips that have darkened from handling and absorbed the oils from countless hands. This is what bronze means in practical terms: a tool that lasts, that doesn't need constant replacement, that can be passed down or traded when its owner no longer needs it, accumulating history and stories along with wear. Morning comes slowly. The fire has burned down to coals, which someone revives with dry grass and fresh wood, blowing gently to encourage the flames. Breakfast is simple: flatbread that's starting to go stale but is still edible when torn into pieces, a little cheese that's been carefully wrapped to keep it from drying out completely, water from skins that get refilled at every stream or well. The donkeys are checked for any signs of lameness or harness wear, loads adjusted to redistribute weight if any animal seems to be struggling, and the group sets out again, following the path as it curves along the coast. The landscape is dry and rocky, dotted with low shrubs that somehow survive on minimal rainfall and occasional fog, their leaves small and waxy to prevent moisture loss. The occasional stunted tree clings to the hillside, twisted by constant wind into shapes that seem more like sculpture than natural growth. In the distance, you can see the blue line of the sea, glittering in the early light, stretching to a horizon that appears closer than it actually is due to the elevation. This is what most of the Bronze Age looks like, not grand battles or monumental construction. though those things happen too, but patient movement. Materials travelling across long distances, slowly, in small quantities. Knowledge spreading the same way, carried by people who have learned something useful, and pass it along to the next settlement, the next smith, the next curious experimenter, willing to try variations and see what happens. Progress measured not in years, but in generations, with each generation building on what the previous one learned, adding small refinements that compound over time. Sometimes, the materials travelling these routes are even stranger than bronze. Meteoritic iron, for example. Iron that arrives not from ore deposits in the ground, but from space, carried down as fragments of asteroids that survive atmospheric entry and land, scattered across the landscape like gifts from an indifferent sky, occasionally witnessed by people who see the bright streak across the night sky and hear the distant impact, occasionally just found years or decades later by someone ploughing a field or clearing land for construction. You're in a different place now, somewhere in the Near East, in a region where meteor strikes are uncommon but not unheard of. The landscape is flatter here, agricultural, with fields that have been cultivated for centuries until the soil is intimately known and managed. A farmer has found a chunk of metal while ploughing. The plough blade struck something hard enough to jar the whole implement and make the ox pulling its snort in protest. The farmer investigated and found this thing, buried shallow enough that it was only luck it hadn't been struck before, heavy, irregular, pitted on the surface from its burning passage through the atmosphere, clearly not anything that grew or was placed deliberately. The metal is dark, almost black, with a faint sheen where the surface has been scratched by the plough blade. It doesn't look like much, but it's clearly not stone. Stone doesn't have this kind of weight, this kind of solidity. The farmer brings it back to the settlement and eventually shows it to the local smith, who examines it with cautious interest mixed with puzzlement. The smith has worked copper and bronze for years, knows those materials intimately, but this is something different. The colour is wrong. The weight is wrong. Even the way it feels in the hand is subtly off, as if it contains more substance than its size should allow. The smith tries treating it like copper ore, heating it in the furnace to see if anything useful happens. The metal doesn't melt, not at the temperatures the furnace can reach, which are sufficient for bronze, but apparently not for this darker substance. But it does soften slightly, enough that it can be hammered, though it requires more force than bronze and springs back more stubbornly, resisting the shape being imposed on it. The smith works carefully, heating the meteoritic iron until it glows a dull red, then hammering it, then reheating, repeating the cycle dozens of times. Gradually the irregular chunk of space metal begins to take on a more intentional form, flattened, elongated, shaped into a blade that's rougher and less refined than bronze work, but clearly deliberate. The process is slow and requires more effort than working bronze, but the result is impressive enough to justify the labour. The blade is harder than bronze, holds an edge better, and has a distinctive dark colour that catches attention, that looks serious and functional in a way that bronze's golden gleam somehow doesn't quite match. The smith polishes the blade as much as the material will allow, creates a simple handle from wood and leather, and presents it to the farmer who found the meteorite. A gift or payment, or perhaps just a way to ensure the farmer brings any similar finds to this workshop in the future. Meteoritic iron remains rare. You can't rely on finding it, can't predict where it will turn up, can't organise an economy around something so unpredictable. But when it does appear, it gets treated as something special, fashioned into ceremonial objects, high-status tools, gifts for rulers who appreciate both the material's practical qualities and its origin story. The famous iron dagger found in Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered in the wrappings near the young king's thigh, was made from meteoritic iron, identified by its nickel content, which is characteristic of space-origin metal. The dagger was valuable not because iron was inherently useful at that point in history. Bronze was still the practical choice for most tools and weapons, but because it was rare, exotic, difficult to work, and came with a story about falling from the sky. For a long time, this is the only kind of iron available. True iron smelting, extracting iron from terrestrial ore, the kind you can mine deliberately and find in predictable locations, requires significantly higher temperatures than copper or bronze production, and figuring out how to achieve those temperatures takes centuries of experimentation. The technology develops slowly, unevenly, in scattered locations where conditions happen to be right. Some regions figure it out earlier, possibly by accident when a particularly hot pottery kiln happens to smelt iron ore that was used as part of the kiln structure. Others continue using bronze long after iron has become common elsewhere, either because they lack the right kind of ore, or because bronze working traditions are so established that there's resistance to change. You're standing now in a later period, maybe 1200 years before the start of the Common Era, in a region where iron smelting has just started to become practical enough to attempt regularly. The furnace is different from the bronze smelting furnaces you saw earlier. It's taller, more enclosed, built from clay and stone with careful attention to insulation, with a narrow chimney that draws air upward, creating a stronger draft that pulls fresh air in from below. The fire inside burns hotter than anything used for bronze, fed constantly with charcoal and blasted with air from bellows worked by an assistant, who pumps rhythmically, steadily for hours, building up arm strength that makes other physical labour seem trivial by comparison. The ore being smelted is hematite, iron oxide, a reddish-brown stone that's common enough in many regions but not immediately recognisable as metal-bearing, unless you already know what you're looking for. It doesn't have the distinctive appearance of malachite or the weight of pure metal. It just looks like rock, albeit rock with an interesting colour that might make it useful for pigment. The smelting process is complicated, far more demanding than copper or bronze work. The iron doesn't melt cleanly the way copper does, flowing into a liquid state that can be poured into moulds. Instead, it forms a spongy mass called a bloom, a lump of iron mixed with slag and impurities, glowing dull red that has to be hammered repeatedly while still hot to drive out the slag, and consolidate the iron into something workable. The smith pulls the bloom from the furnace with long tongs, moving quickly because the material cools fast and becomes unworkable if the temperature drops too far. He sets it on an anvil stone, a large flat rock that's been selected for its hardness and stability, and begins hammering. Each strike produces a shower of sparks, bits of burning slag ejected by the impact, and a dull ringing sound that echoes across the workshop. The bloom gradually compacts, flattens, takes on a more uniform texture. The slag, glassy, brittle, worthless, breaks away and falls to the ground, accumulating in a growing pile of dark fragments that will eventually be swept aside and discarded. What remains is a rough billet of wrought iron, still full of imperfections, still containing some slag that refuse to separate, but usable. This billet will be reheated and hammered many more times before it becomes a finished tool. The process is labour-intensive, far more so than working bronze. Each piece of iron requires hours of work, cycles of heating and hammering that gradually refine the material, slowly working out impurities and creating a more consistent structure. But iron has one significant advantage that makes all this labour worthwhile. It's abundant. Iron ore is vastly more common than tin, and once you've figured out how to smelt it, you're no longer dependent on long-distance trade networks to supply your raw material. A single region can produce all the iron it needs, assuming it has access to ore, charcoal and skilled labour. The shift from bronze to iron doesn't happen quickly. For centuries both metals coexist, used for different purposes depending on availability, cost and tradition. Bronze remains the preferred material for certain applications. Decorative work, bells, mirrors, anything where the golden colour and corrosion resistance of bronze are valued over raw hardness. Bronze also continues to be used in regions where iron smelting technology hasn't arrived yet, or where bronze working is so established that switching to iron would require retraining entire workshops. Iron dominates in areas where durability and abundance matter. Farming tools that take heavy abuse, construction hardware that needs to hold weight, everyday knives that will be used constantly and can't be delicate. You're walking now through a village in what will eventually be called Anatolia, during a period when iron tools are becoming common, but still notable enough that people comment on them. The blacksmith's workshop is larger than the bronzesmith's workshop you saw earlier, with multiple furnaces and several assistants working simultaneously on different tasks. The air smells like charcoal smoke and hot metal, a sharp, acrid combination that gets into your throat and stays there. The ground is littered with iron scraps, curls of metal from grinding broken tools brought in for repair, bent nails that couldn't be salvaged, and piles of charcoal waiting to be fed into the furnaces, each piece carefully selected for size and quality. One of the assistants is making nails, simple, unglamorous, but essential for the kind of wooden construction that's becoming more common, as iron makes fasteners more affordable. He works at a smaller anvil, heating iron rods in a forge and then hammering them quickly into shape. A point at one end formed by striking the rod at an angle, and a flat head at the other, created by hammering the rod's end while it rests in a depression in the anvil. Each nail takes only a minute or two to make, and by the end of the day he'll have produced hundreds. These nails will be used to build houses, boats, carts, anything that needs to be fastened together more permanently than rope or wooden pegs allow, but doesn't require the expense of more elaborate joinery. Another assistant is repairing a plough blade, re-welding a crack that formed during use. The blade is old, visibly worn, the cutting edge reduced from repeated sharpening, but still worth repairing because making a new blade would take longer and require more material. The assistant heats the cracked section until both edges glow bright yellow, then hammers them together, fusing the iron in a weld that will be stronger than the surrounding material if done correctly. The technique requires precise temperature control. Too cool and the iron won't fuse, too hot and it burns, becoming brittle and useless, and considerable experience to execute reliably. The head smith is working on something more delicate, a set of shears for cutting fabric. The blades need to be thin enough to pass each other smoothly, evenly matched so they meet along their entire length, and sharpened carefully so they actually cut rather than just crushing the fabric between them. This requires more skill than making nails or axe heads, demands an understanding of how iron behaves when forged thin, and the smith works slowly, checking the fit repeatedly, adjusting the curve of each blade until the shears open and close smoothly, with a crisp, snicking sound that indicates proper alignment. When the shears are finished, they'll be sold or traded to someone who works with textiles. A tailor maybe, or someone who prepares wool for weaving, cutting fleeces into manageable sections. The sun is setting now, and the light inside the workshop shifts from bright to dim. The fires in the furnaces glow more visibly as the natural light fades, casting moving shadows on the walls and ceiling. The assistants begin cleaning up, banking the fires so they'll stay warm overnight without consuming too much fuel, sweeping scraps into a pile for later sorting, covering unfinished work with cloth to keep off the dust that settles constantly in a workspace where so much grinding and hammering happens. The headsmith examines the shears one last time, flexing the blades gently to confirm they still move smoothly, then sets them aside with other completed work and stretches, rolling his shoulders to loosen the tension from hours of careful hammering and precise control. Outside, the village is settling into evening routines. Smoke rises from cooking fires in a dozen different locations, thin columns that merge and disperse in the still air. Voices drift from nearby houses, low, conversational, punctuated by the occasional laugh or a child's question that goes unanswered or gets a response too quiet to hear from this distance. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then stops, either satisfied or distracted by something more interesting. The air is cooling, losing the harsh heat of midday, becoming something gentler, more tolerable, almost pleasant. You linger near the workshop for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. The bronze and iron that humans have learned to coax from stone have reshaped daily life in ways that are easy to overlook because they're so mundane, so thoroughly integrated into normal existence that they become invisible. Tools that last longer than their users, fasteners that hold structures together through decades of weather, blades that keep their edge through seasons of use. None of it is glamorous, but all of it matters. All of it accumulates, quietly, into something larger. A world where materials can be transformed, where resources can be managed and shaped and directed towards specific purposes, where the gap between what people need and what they can produce gradually narrows. The strange metal that actually changed the ancient world wasn't strange because it had magical properties, or because it required lost knowledge or impossible techniques. It was strange because it didn't behave like anything else people had worked with before. Stone is hard but brittle, excellent for some purposes, useless for others, fundamentally limited by its nature. Wood is flexible but weak, prone to rot, vulnerable to insects and fire. Bone is strong but limited by the size and shape of the animal it came from, difficult to reshape once you've stripped it from the carcass. Metal, copper, bronze, iron, could be melted, poured, hammered, shaped, reshaped and repaired. It could be made into forms that nature never produced. And once people figured that out, once the knowledge spread widely enough that every settlement had access to metal tools, or at least knew they existed, they started applying it everywhere they could think of, in ways both practical and symbolic, both necessary and decorative. You're somewhere else now, a coastal settlement where traders have brought a small shipment of bronze ingots and a rumour about a new alloy. The rumour is vague, third-hand information passed along trade routes where details get distorted. Something about adding a different metal to copper, something that makes the result harder than bronze but easier to cast. Or maybe that's not quite right. Maybe it was easier to polish. Or perhaps the claim was about colour rather than hardness. The local smiths are sceptical but curious, because new techniques are always worth investigating, even if they turn out to be exaggerated or impractical, or based on a misunderstanding of what's actually happening in the smelting process. One of the smiths decides to experiment. He has access to a few different metals, copper in reasonable quantity, tin that arrived with a recent shipment, a small amount of zinc that arrived as part of a mixed cargo, and was initially assumed to be something else until testing revealed its properties. He tries various combinations, melting them together in small batches, carefully recording which mixtures work and which don't, by scratching notes onto pottery sherds that accumulate in a corner of the workshop. Most of the experiments produce nothing interesting. Alloys that are too brittle, cracking when hammered, or too soft, deforming under pressure that bronze would easily resist, or that develop strange surface textures when cooled, or that smell odd when heated, releasing vapours that suggest some unwanted chemical reaction. But one mixture, copper with a significant proportion of zinc, yields something promising. A golden yellow metal that's harder than bronze and casts more smoothly, filling moulds more completely with fewer voids and imperfections. The smith makes careful note of the proportions, tests the result by making several small castings, and confirms that the new alloy is consistent, reproducible, potentially valuable. Brass, though the smith doesn't call it that. He just knows that he's made something useful, something that might be worth producing in larger quantities if he can secure a reliable supply of zinc. He casts a few small ornaments, brooches, rings, decorative fittings for wooden boxes, and tests the market response by bringing them to the next local gathering where goods are traded. People like the colour. Brass looks expensive, looks like gold to untrained eyes, or at least like something close enough to gold that it carries similar associations, and it doesn't tarnish as quickly as copper, maintaining its bright appearance longer with less maintenance. The ornaments sell well, better than similar items in bronze, and the smith makes more, gradually refining his technique, learning exactly how much zinc to add for the best combination of colour and workability. This is how knowledge spreads in the ancient world, not through published papers or formal institutions, Not through universities or scientific journals that won't exist for millennia, but through hands-on experimentation, market feedback, and apprenticeship. A smith teaches an apprentice, passing along not just techniques, but the reasoning behind them, the principles that make certain procedures work and others fail. The apprentice eventually travels to another settlement, either seeking better opportunities or fleeing some local conflict or simply wanting to see more of the world, and teaches someone else, who modifies the technique slightly based on local conditions or available materials and passes it along further. Over generations, small improvements accumulate. Furnaces get hotter through better insulation and more efficient air delivery. Moulds get more precise through better carving techniques and improved materials. Alloys get more consistent through better understanding of proportions and temperatures. You're travelling again, this time following a river that cuts through a broad valley. The landscape is greener here, more fertile, with fields of grain stretching along both banks, interrupted by small villages and the occasional larger town where multiple trade routes intersect. The river's shallow enough in places to ford on foot, the water flowing clear over gravel beds, deeper elsewhere, requiring a boat or raft to cross safely. You're on a raft now, a simple construction of lashed logs that floats low in the water, loaded with trade goods that represent months of accumulated work from multiple craftspeople. Ceramic jars sealed with wax, bales of wool that have been cleaned and prepared for spinning, a few bronze tools wrapped in oiled leather to prevent rust. The river current does most of the work, carrying the raft downstream at a steady, unhurried pace that matches the general rhythm of ancient commerce. The raft's operator uses a long pole to keep it away from the banks and to navigate around submerged rocks that would hole the raft if struck directly, working with the kind of automatic competence that comes from years of experience. The water is murky, brown with silt from upstream erosion, and the sound it makes as it flows around the logs is a soft, continuous gurgle that becomes background noise after a while, noticed only when it changes pitch or volume to indicate some shift in current or depth. Overhead, the sky's pale blue, cloudless, and the sun beats down with an intensity that makes you squint if you look up too long, that creates a bright glare on the water's surface. The raft operator has rigged a simple canopy from woven reeds, providing a small patch of shade where you can sit without being completely exposed to the sun's assault. The air smells like river water, like wet wood and mud, and the faint decay of aquatic vegetation rotting in the shallows. At a bend in the river, the raft pulls to shore near a small trading post, a cluster of wooden structures built on stilts to avoid flooding during the seasonal high water. The operator secures the raft to a post driven into the riverbank and begins unloading the cargo with help from a few locals who've come down to see what's available, what's being offered that might be worth trading for. The bronze tools are inspected closely, tested for balance and sharpness, examined for any flaws or cracks that might indicate inferior work. One man hefts and adds, swinging it experimentally to check the weight distribution, sighting along the blade to confirm it's straight. Eventually he nods and begins negotiating price. The transaction is slow, involves a lot of discussion about quality and current market conditions, comparisons to other tools seen recently, complaints about how expensive everything has become. The negotiation has a ritualistic quality, both parties aware that they'll eventually reach an agreement, but neither willing to rush the process because rushing suggests desperation or ignorance. Eventually they settle on a trade. The bronze adds for a substantial quantity of grain, a bundle of dried herbs that are difficult to source in the operator's home region, and a small amount of silver, tiny fragments cut from a larger ingot with heavy shears, weighed carefully on a balance scale to ensure fairness. Silver is rare this far from the coast, far from the major trade centres where precious metals accumulate. The raft operator is pleased with the deal, wraps the silver in cloth, tucks it into a pouch that goes under his tunic where it can't be easily snatched, and moves on to the next item. By midday, most of the cargo has been traded, and the raft is being reloaded with goods heading the other direction. downstream products exchanged for upstream products in a pattern that's been repeating for generations, creating a slow circulation of materials and goods that connects distant regions through chains of small exchanges. The raft will continue downriver for a few more days, stop at other trading posts where similar transactions will occur, eventually reach a larger settlement near the river's mouth, where the remaining cargo will be traded for other goods, or sold for metal currency, if the settlement is sophisticated enough to use standardized coinage. Then the raft will be disassembled, its logs sold for construction lumber, because hauling them back upstream would require more labour than their value justifies. The operator will return upstream on foot, carrying only a pack of high-value goods, silver, small bronze items, anything compact and valuable enough to be worth the effort of transporting overland. This is the texture of the Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Constant low-level movement, materials circulating along trade routes that stretch hundreds or thousands of miles, knowledge circulating through the same routes, carried by craftspeople and traders who share techniques in exchange for hospitality or payment. People moving slowly across landscapes, following paths that have been travelled for generations, carrying tools, stories, rumours, innovations. Nothing happens quickly, but everything is in motion. You're in a different workshop now, in a different region entirely, where the climate is cooler and the architecture reflects that difference. Thicker walls, smaller windows, roofs pitched steeply to shed rain and snow. This smith specialises in swords, not the massive heavy weapons you might imagine from later periods, but practical bronze swords about the length of your forearm, designed to be used with a shield for defence. The construction is delicate, demanding. The blade has to be thin enough to be light and quick, thick enough not to bend when it strikes something hard, and tapered so the point is effective for thrusting into gaps in armour or unprotected flesh. The smith works from a pattern, a wooden template that he places on the bronze billet before cutting and filing begin. The template is old, worn smooth from use, slightly warped from years of changing humidity, but still functional. The smith traces around it with a scribe, marking the bronze with fine lines that guide the initial shaping. Then comes the careful work of filing, removing material gradually, checking the shape frequently against the template to ensure accuracy. The blade takes shape slowly over several days. The smith uses files of different coarseness, starting with rough files that remove material quickly but leave deep scratches, progressing to finer files that smooth the surface and refine the contours. He works carefully because bronze, despite being harder than copper, is still soft enough that aggressive filing can ruin the shape, remove too much material from one spot, or create an uneven surface that will be difficult to correct. He tests the balance frequently, holding the blade by the tang, the narrow section that will be inserted into the handle, and feeling how the weight distributes along its length. A well-balanced sword feels almost alive in your hand, responsive, easy to control. A poorly balanced sword feels clumsy, exhausting to use, like fighting against the weapon itself while also fighting an opponent. When the blade is finished, shaped and filed and polished until it gleams, the smith wraps the tang with the leather strips to form a grip that's comfortable to hold and won't slip when your hand sweats. He attaches a simple bronze crossguard, a flat piece of metal with a slot for the tang, positioned to protect the hand from an opponent's blade sliding down during a clash. The sword isn't elaborate, no decorative engraving, no jewelled pommel, no precious metals inlaid in the blade, but it's functional, well made, and will serve its owner reliably for years if it's cared for properly, cleaned after use, oiled to prevent corrosion, stored in a dry place. Bronze swords like this one will remain in use for centuries, gradually being replaced by iron as ironworking techniques improve, and iron becomes cheaper and more readily available. But even after iron swords become common, bronze swords don't disappear entirely. They continue to be made for ceremonial purposes, for display, for situations where the golden colour of bronze is valued over the practical advantages of iron, where tradition matters more than pure functionality. You're outside now, standing in an open courtyard as the last light fades from the sky. The smith has finished work for the day and is locking up the workshop, securing the door with a wooden bar that drops into iron brackets, and checking that the furnace has been properly banked. The coals covered with ash, so they'll stay alive overnight without consuming much fuel. Tomorrow, he'll start a new project. Maybe another sword, maybe something smaller, maybe a set of armour fittings that someone has commissioned. The work continues, day after day, season after season, with a rhythm that's both repetitive and subtly variable. Each project similar to previous ones, but never exactly the same. The courtyard is quiet now, the sounds of the day's work fading into memory. Somewhere nearby, a night bird calls, a low, warbling sound that echoes faintly off the surrounding buildings. The stars are beginning to appear, scattered across the darkening sky like tiny fires, reflected in still water, slowly becoming more visible as the ambient light fades. The air smells like dust and wood smoke and the faint metallic tang that lingers near any place where metal is worked regularly, where countless small particles of copper and bronze and iron have accumulated in the soil over years. Bronze and iron have transformed the ancient world, not through sudden invention or dramatic breakthroughs, but through patient incremental application. They've made farming more efficient by providing better ploughs and sickles. They've made construction more durable by providing nails and hinges and structural reinforcements. They've made warfare more organised and more lethal by providing better weapons and armour. They've made trade more extensive by providing tools for shipbuilding and cart construction. But the transformation hasn't been even or universal. Some regions adopt metalworking early and build entire economies around it, developing sophisticated techniques and extensive distribution networks. Other regions continue using stone tools for centuries, either because they lack access to ore or because their existing technologies work well enough that there's no urgent need to change. No compelling reason to invest the time and resources needed to learn metalworking. You're travelling once more, this time on foot, following a path that winds through low hills covered in scrub. The landscape is dry, the vegetation sparse, thorny bushes that look half dead, tough grass that crunches underfoot, the occasional stunted tree bent by constant wind. Lizards scatter as you approach, vanishing into cracks between rocks with a speed that seems impossible for creatures that size. The sun is overhead, and the heat is intense, pressing down like a physical weight, making the air shimmer and distort distant views. You keep moving because stopping in the middle of the day means wasting hours waiting for the temperature to drop, and the schedule is tight enough that delays aren't welcome. Eventually the path descends into a shallow valley where a small stream provides enough water to support a permanent settlement. The buildings here are simple, stone walls mortared with clay, thatched roofs that provide shade and reasonable protection from rain, narrow doorways that keep the interior cool. A few people are visible, working in shaded areas, moving slowly to conserve energy in the heat. One person is grinding grain between two stones, producing a steady scraping rhythm that carries across the otherwise quiet valley. Another is repairing a woven mat, replacing broken reeds with fresh ones, fingers moving with practiced efficiency. You stop to rest near the stream, crouching in the shade of a large boulder that blocks the sun's direct assault. The water is clear, cool, moving slowly over smooth pebbles with a gentle murmur that's almost musical. You drink, cupping water in your hands, splash water on your face and neck, and sit quietly for a while, listening to the stream's soft sound, feeling the immediate heat fade slightly in the shade. The settlement feels isolated, far from major trade routes, from workshops full of assistants and multiple furnaces, from anywhere you've been recently. But even here, metal has arrived. One of the people working nearby is using a bronze knife to trim reeds, cutting them to uniform length for mat weaving. The knife is old, its blade worn thin from repeated sharpening over years or decades, the edge no longer perfectly straight, but still functional, still capable of making clean cuts. The presence of that single knife represents connections that stretch across hundreds of miles. The ore that was mined from some distant hillside and smelted in a workshop far from here. The smith who cast and shaped the blade using techniques learned through years of apprenticeship. The traders who carried it along rivers and roads, through settlements and markets. The exchanges that gradually moved it from where it was made to where it's needed. All of that effort, all of that accumulated knowledge and labour, now concentrated in a small bronze blade that makes trimming reeds slightly easier than using a stone flake would be. You rest for a while longer, then stand and continue along the path. The valley opens up ahead, leading into more open terrain where the walking is easier but the shade is scarcer. The sun is beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, and the heat is starting to ease, becoming merely uncomfortable rather than oppressive. By evening you'll reach another settlement, larger than this one, where you'll find food, shelter, probably more evidence of metalworking, maybe a smith's workshop, maybe just more tools in daily use, more bronze knives and awls and needles that have become so common they're barely noticed. Bronze and iron aren't the only metals that matter, of course. Gold and silver have been valued since people first figured out how to extract them from ore, recognise them as rare and beautiful and resistant to tarnish. But gold and silver are soft, unsuitable for tools, useful primarily as stores of value and symbols of status. They don't make better ploughs. They don't improve agriculture or construction or transportation. They just sit there, gleaming, accumulating meaning through social consensus, rather than practical utility. Bronze and iron are different. They're practical. They solve problems. They make difficult tasks easier and impossible tasks possible. And because they're practical, they spread wherever there's a need for better tools and the resources to produce them, or deposits, fuel for furnaces, skilled labour, trade networks to move materials from where they're found to where they're needed. You're in yet another workshop, this one specialising in small, precise work. Needles, pins, fish hooks, anything that requires fine control and careful finishing. The smith here is older, his hands showing visible wear from decades of holding tools, calluses, scars, fingers that don't straighten completely anymore, but still steady, still capable of the delicate work his reputation is built on. He's making a bronze fishhook, working from a small coil of bronze wire that he heats in a small forge and then manipulates with pliers and small hammers. The hook has to curve smoothly, without any flat spots or awkward angles, taper to a sharp point that will penetrate a fish's mouth easily, and have a small eye at the top for attaching a line. The whole thing is smaller than your thumb, but the smith works with the same careful attention he'd give to a larger project, checking the curve repeatedly, adjusting it with tiny taps from a small hammer, testing the point's sharpness against a scrap of leather. When the hook is finished, he tests it by pulling hard on a short length of twine tied through the eye. The hook holds. The point is sharp enough to pierce flesh easily. The curve is smooth, properly shaped to catch in a fish's mouth and resist pulling free. The smith nods, satisfied, and sets the hook aside with a small pile of others he's completed today. Tomorrow, these hooks will be sold or traded, probably to someone who fishes for a living, who will use them until they're lost or broken, which happens regularly because fish hooks are easy to lose, easy to bend beyond repair, easy to snap when a large fish pulls hard, and then come back for more. This is the scale at which metalworking operates for most of the ancient world. Individual craftspeople making individual objects one at a time for specific purposes. There's no mass production, no standardization beyond the rough categories that emerge naturally from common needs. No large factories turning out identical products at high volume. Every bronze knife, every iron nail, every brass ornament is slightly different, shaped by the particular hands that made it, marked by the quirks and preferences of the smith who decided exactly how thick the blade should be, or how much curve the hook needs, or how smooth the finish should be polished. You step outside into the late afternoon. The workshop is located near a harbour, and you can see boats tied up along a wooden dock. Fishing boats mostly, small enough to be rowed or sailed by one or two people, built from planks that have been shaped with bronze adzes and fastened with iron nails. The water is calm, reflecting the sky like a polished mirror, barely moving except where boats create small wakes. A few birds circle overhead, calling to each other in sharp, piercing cries that carry well over the water. The harbour smells like salt and fish and wet wood and tar used for waterproofing. Nets are spread out on the dock to dry, their meshes repaired with new cordage where old sections have rotted or torn. Small bronze weights attached to keep them sinking properly when deployed. Someone is scraping barnacles off the hull of an overturned boat, working methodically with a bronze blade mounted on a wooden handle, removing the encrusted growth that slows a boat if left too long. The sound is rhythmic, scraping and pausing, with a patience that suggests there's no hurry, no deadline, just the task and the time it takes to complete it properly. You walk along the dock, passing coiled ropes treated with oil to resist rot, stacked crates that once held fish but now await new cargo. A few baskets of the day's catch being sorted by size, the smaller fish destined for local consumption, the larger ones possibly heading to market in a nearby town. At the end of the dock you stop and look out across the water. The horizon is a thin, pale line where the sea meets the sky, indistinct, wavering slightly in the heat. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across the dock, turning the water from blue to gold in the areas where sunlight strikes directly. This is what the strange metal has made possible. Not just the hooks and blades and tools themselves, but the activities those tools enable. Fishing becomes more efficient with better hooks that catch more reliably and hold more securely. Construction becomes more durable with iron nails that resist corrosion better than wooden pegs and distribute loads more evenly. Trade becomes more extensive when goods can be carried in carts reinforced with metal fittings, when ships can be built larger and stronger with metal fasteners holding their planks together. None of it is dramatic or revolutionary in isolation. All of it accumulates over generations into something larger. The sun continues its descent. The shadows lengthen further. The air cools gradually, losing the harsh intensity of midday, becoming something gentler. You turn back from the dock and walk into the settlement proper, where evening routines are beginning. Fires being lit for cooking, meals being prepared, the day's work giving way to the night's rest. Children run through narrow streets, their voices high and excited, playing some game that involves a lot of running and tagging and arguments about rules. Dogs lie in patches of remaining sunlight, conserving energy, occasionally lifting their heads to track movement or investigate interesting smells. You find a place to sit near one of the communal fires, a stone ledge that's still warm from the afternoon sun. Around you, people are settling in for the evening, talking quietly, sharing food, tending to small tasks that don't require full daylight. A child is playing with a small bronze toy, a simple figure of an animal that's been polished smooth by handling, running it along the edge of the stone ledge while making soft sound effects. An older person is sharpening a knife on a whetstone, working slowly, checking the edge with a thumb after every few strokes, patient and methodical. The fire crackles softly, fed with dry wood that produces minimal smoke. The flames dance and flicker, casting moving shadows on nearby walls, creating small zones of warmth as the air continues to cool. Smoke drifts upward, dispersing into the darkening sky, carrying the scent of burning wood mixed with whatever's cooking. Something savoury, something that makes your stomach remind you that you haven't eaten in hours. The stars are out now, more visible than they were earlier, scattered across the heavens in patterns that ancient people have learned to recognise and use for navigation, for tracking seasons, for organising agricultural cycles. The metalworking knowledge that's spread across continents isn't the only knowledge circulating through these trade routes. There's also astronomy, carefully observed and recorded, agriculture, refined through generations of experimentation, medicine, based on accumulated experience with what works and what doesn't, architecture, gradually improving as techniques spread and materials become available, all of it moving slowly, carried by travellers, traders, teachers, People who've learned something useful and are willing to share it in exchange for food, shelter, payment, or simply the satisfaction of passing knowledge forward. You sit quietly, watching the fire, feeling the warmth on your face and hands while the air behind you cools. The strange metal that changed the ancient world is everywhere now, woven into daily life so thoroughly that it's easy to forget how remarkable it once seemed, how revolutionary it must have been when someone first pulled that bead of copper from the fire and realised it could be shaped. But if you think back to that first person crouching by a fire, watching a greenish stone sweat metal, you can trace a line from that moment to this one, a line made of accumulated knowledge, patient experimentation, countless small improvements that together reshaped civilization, enabled new activities, connected distant regions, allowed human societies to grow larger and more complex. The fire burns lower. The conversations around it grow softer, individual voices becoming harder to distinguish as the volume drops and people's energy fades. One by one, people drift away to their homes, their sleeping mats, their own quiet corners of the settlement where they'll rest before tomorrow brings another day of work. The stars continue their slow rotation overhead, marking time in a way that's both ancient and eternal. The same patterns that guided people centuries ago still visible, still reliable. You remain by the fire a little longer, letting the warmth soak in, feeling the weight of the day's walking settle into your bones, accumulate as a pleasant tiredness that suggests sleep will come easily. The workshop you visited earlier is dark now, its furnaces cold, its tools set aside until morning when the work will resume. But tomorrow the smith will return, the fires will be relit, the hammering will begin again. Another day of heating metal, shaping it, turning raw ore into something useful, and the day after that, and the day after that, in an endless cycle that stretches forward into the future and backward into the past, connecting this moment to thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and technique. Eventually you stand and move away from the fire, finding a place to sleep under a simple shelter. A wooden frame covered with reeds, open on one side to the night air, humble but adequate. The ground is hard but not uncomfortable, covered with a woven mat that provides some padding. You lie down, pulling a woven blanket over yourself, and close your eyes, listening to the last sounds of the settlement preparing for night. The sounds fade gradually. The last murmured conversations, the final crackling of the communal fire, the distant rhythm of waves on the shore, if you're close enough to the coast to hear them, or just the quiet movement of wind through vegetation if you're inland. The darkness is complete now, broken only by starlight and the faint red glow of dying embers from fires that weren't quite extinguished, that will smoulder through the night and be revived in the morning. And as you drift towards sleep, the story of bronze and iron continues in workshops and furnaces scattered across the ancient world. Metal flowing into moulds, hammers ringing against anvils, smoke rising from fires that burn through the night to maintain temperature, all of it patient, all of it gradual, all of it building towards something larger, something that won't be fully visible for centuries but is already taking shape in the accumulated weight of 10,000 small transformations, each one adding to the total, each one moving civilization slightly forward. The strange metal that actually changed the ancient world wasn't magic. It wasn't impossible technology, or forbidden knowledge, or anything requiring supernatural intervention. It was just careful observation combined with patient experimentation. Generations of craftspeople learning what worked and what didn't, slowly figuring out how to extract metal from stone, how to shape it, how to combine different metals into alloys with useful properties. The transformation it enabled was real and significant. Better tools, more durable construction, more extensive trade, more complex societies. But it happened gradually, accumulating over centuries rather than arriving suddenly. You're deeply relaxed now, on the edge of sleep, barely aware of your surroundings. The blanket is warm, the mat beneath you has stopped feeling hard, The sounds of the night have become background texture, noticed but not requiring attention. Your breathing has slowed, become regular and deep. Your muscles have released the tension they held during the day's travel. Somewhere in the distance, metal is still being worked. A smith working late, or an early riser beginning before dawn, or perhaps someone working through the night because a particular project requires continuous attention. The sound of hammer on anvil carries across the still night air, faint, rhythmic, patient. Strike and pause. Strike and pause. Each blow shaping metal slightly, moving it gradually toward its final form. The last thing you're aware of before sleep takes you completely is that distant hammering, steady and unhurried, like a heartbeat, or the rhythm of waves, or any other natural cycle that continues regardless of whether anyone is paying attention. The work continues, the knowledge spreads, the strange metal moves through human hands, across human landscapes, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of generations. And then even that fades, and there's only darkness and warmth and the quiet descent into sleep, where the story continues in dreams that blend past and present, where ancient workshops exist alongside modern understanding, where the line between then and now blurs until it doesn't matter anymore because the fundamental patterns remain unchanged. Human curiosity, human patience, human persistence in learning how the world works, and how its materials can be shaped to serve human needs. The furnaces cool, the metal rests, the night deepens, and sleep, like bronze settling into a mould, gradually takes its final form. You're settling in to discover a world that vanished beneath waves so gradually that no single generation noticed the transformation. Tonight's journey takes you back approximately 20,000 years to the Persian Gulf, a place that wasn't a gulf at all, but a verdant river valley where some of humanity's earliest communities built lives along waterways that no longer exist. Close your eyes and prepare to walk through settlements that drowned one careful step at a time, leaving behind only whispers and flood myths and fragments beneath the modern seafloor. The land stretches before you in the half-light of dawn, 15,000 years before anyone will call this place the Persian Gulf. You're standing in a river valley so vast that you can't see the opposite ridge, even on the clearest morning. The air tastes different here than it will in the future, drier, carrying dust from exposed seabeds that your distant descendants will only know as underwater landscapes. Two rivers converge somewhere to your north, the ancient predecessors of the Tigris and Euphrates, but they're broader here, lazier, carving through sediment that will one day rest 300 feet beneath salt water. Your feet press into soil that has never known the sea. Small acacias dot the landscape, their roots reaching down into groundwater that flows in predictable patterns. You notice how the vegetation follows invisible lines across the valley floor, marking ancient watercourses that shift with the seasons but always return to their favoured channels. A herd of onager, wild relatives of donkeys, moves across the middle distance, their dust trail catching the morning light in a way that makes them look like they're walking through liquid gold. Someone millennia from now will dredge up their bones from what they'll call the sea floor, puzzling over how land animals ended up in marine sediment, never quite believing the obvious answer. This wasn't always water. The temperature drops noticeably as you walk into the shadow of an escarpment. These rock faces will become dive sites for recreational scuba enthusiasts, but right now they're just wind-carved sandstone streaked with mineral deposits that paint abstract patterns across their surfaces. You run your hand along the stone and feel how the wind has polished certain sections to an almost glassy smoothness. Small lizards scatter at your approach, their bodies perfectly adapted to conserving water in an environment that receives perhaps 6 inches of rain in a good year. You're moving toward a cluster of structures that barely qualify as buildings. They're more like windbreaks with delusions of grandeur, circles of stacked stone about waist high, with roofs made from whatever materials were handy. Brush, mostly, with some animal hides stretched across wooden frames that someone probably dragged from the river valley's upper reaches. Smoke rises from several of these dwellings, not in dramatic plumes but in apologetic wisps, as if the fires themselves aren't quite convinced they're worth the effort. A woman emerges from one structure carrying a basket woven from river reeds. She's wearing what you'd generously call clothing, mostly animal hides worked soft through a process you don't want to think about too carefully while trying to fall asleep. Her hands move with practiced efficiency as she sorts through small shells, separating them by size into different piles. These aren't seashells, despite how that sounds. They're freshwater mollusks from the river, and she's probably preparing them for either food or trade. You notice she keeps glancing toward the eastern horizon, where the sky is brightening in shades that don't have names yet. The settlement, you hesitate to call it a village, contains perhaps 20 of these structures arranged in no particular pattern that you can discern. People move between them with the unhurried pace of individuals who understand that rushing accomplishes nothing in a landscape this size. A man works at chipping stone tools near the largest dwelling, the rhythmic tapping of his hammerstone providing an oddly soothing percussion to the morning. The flakes that spiral away from his work will eventually become part of the archaeological record. Tiny time capsules that will utterly confuse marine geologists who expect only ocean-borne sediments at these depths. You walk past what might be the community's proudest achievement, a stone-lined well that extends down about 15 feet. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to shore up the walls with carefully selected rocks, creating a structure that should last generations. It will, in fact, last considerably longer than that, though it will spend most of that time underwater, slowly filling with marine sediment until archaeologists in the 21st century will spend months arguing about whether it's a natural feature or human-made. The water level inside sits about 8 feet down, and you can see where people have worn smooth grooves in the stone from centuries of rope work, hauling up container after container of water that tastes faintly metallic, but is otherwise perfectly drinkable. Children play near the well, engaged in a game that seems to involve throwing pebbles at a target scratched into the dirt. They're loud in the way children everywhere are loud, their voices carrying across the settlement with complete disregard for anyone trying to sleep late. One of them, a girl perhaps 7 or 8 years old, has developed an impressive throwing technique, releasing each stone with a little flick of her wrist that sends it spinning through the air with unusual accuracy. You suspect she'll grow up to be excellent at hunting small game, assuming she survives the various hazards that make childhood in this era a rather uncertain proposition. The river itself runs about 2 miles from here, though its exact distance changes with the seasons. Right now, in what passes for spring in this climate, it's swollen with runoff from mountains so distant they're more concept than reality to the people living here. You make your way toward it, following a well-worn path that generations of feet have pressed into the hard pan. The vegetation thickens as you approach the water, not dramatically, but enough that you notice the transition from sparse scrubland to something approaching actual greenery. Tamarisk trees cluster near the riverbank, their feathery branches creating patches of shade that feel like luxury in this sun-hammered landscape. You spot evidence of beaver activity, not the same species that will later inhabit North American streams, but a related creature with similar engineering ambitions. They've constructed a dam that's redirecting perhaps a third of the river's flow into a side channel, creating a quieter pool where fish congregate in numbers that must seem like providence to anyone with a spear and patience. A woman stands in the shallows, her approach to fishing best described as optimistic. She holds a woven basket submerged to just below the waterline, waiting with the stillness of someone who's done this so many times that her body has memorized the exact posture required. You watch as a fish, something that looks vaguely carp-like, swims obligingly into her trap. She lifts the basket with a smooth motion that sends water cascading through the weave, leaving the fish flopping indignantly inside. She doesn't celebrate or even really acknowledge the catch, just transfers the fish to a larger container and resumes her vigil. This is dinner, or part of it, but it's also just Tuesday, or whatever these people call the third day after the moon does that thing where it looks like someone bit into it. The river itself is nothing like the narrow channelized waterways that will eventually feed into the Persian Gulf. It's perhaps 300 yards across at this point, though during the dry season it probably shrinks to half that. The water runs brown with suspended sediment, carrying the mountain's business down toward the valley floor in a process that has continued since water first found this particular path to follow. Small islands have formed in the middle channel where debris has collected over the years, mostly dead trees and accumulated brush, but also the occasional boulder that some long ago flood carried from upstream. You notice how the settlement's inhabitants have positioned themselves in relation to water. They're close enough to access it easily, but far enough back that even exceptional flooding wouldn't reach their dwellings. This isn't luck or accident. These people, or their ancestors, have watched the river long enough to understand its moods, its maximums, and its behaviour during those rare years when winter storms pile up against the distant mountains and send walls of water churning through the valley. They've built their lives in the safe zone, that perfect distance where convenience meets prudence. As you walk back toward the settlement, you spot something that makes you pause. Carved into a flat section of rock, someone has scratched a series of marks. They're not writing, not quite, but they're not random either. They appear to track something, perhaps lunar cycles, perhaps seasonal changes, perhaps just one person's attempt to impose order on time's relentless forward motion. You count 27 distinct marks before the pattern seems to repeat, which might indicate moon phases or might mean absolutely nothing. Future archaeologists will discover this rock face beneath 50 feet of seawater and will write 3 separate papers arguing about its significance, which seems both appropriate and faintly ridiculous. The sun has fully cleared the horizon now, and the temperature is already climbing toward uncomfortable. People move a bit faster, trying to accomplish tasks before the real heat arrives. A group of men prepares for what looks like a hunting expedition, checking stone-tipped spears and gathering supplies into leather pouches that have been worked soft through processes involving urine and brains that you're grateful you don't have to witness. They'll be gone for days, possibly weeks, following the game into the higher elevations where the temperature stays bearable even in summer. You notice an older woman sitting in the shade of her dwelling, working on what appears to be a hide. She's using a scraping tool made from sharpened bone, removing the last bits of fat and tissue with motions so practiced they're nearly meditative. Her hands are weathered beyond anything you've seen in your own time, marked by decades of work that didn't include moisturizer or ergonomic tool design. She glances up as you pass, and her eyes hold a kind of accumulated knowledge that makes you wonder what stories she could tell if you shared language. She's seen perhaps 50 summers, which makes her ancient by the standards of her community, a repository of information about weather patterns and plant cycles, and where to find water when the obvious sources fail. The settlement contains no monumental architecture, no temples or palaces, or anything that future civilizations would recognize as impressive. These are people living close to subsistence, their entire material culture designed around the basic questions of water, food, and shelter. And yet there's a sophistication here that's easy to miss if you're expecting pyramids. The well represents an enormous investment of labour. The basket weaving shows mathematical understanding of pattern and structure. The careful positioning of dwellings reveals generational knowledge about flood patterns and prevailing winds. You find a spot in the shade and sit, watching the morning unfold with a slowness that feels almost defiant in its refusal to hurry. A dog, or something dog-adjacent, probably several generations removed from wolves but not yet fully committed to domestication, wanders past, tongue lolling in the heat. It pauses to sniff your feet with the suspicious thoroughness of an animal that takes border security seriously, then apparently decides you're neither threatening nor interesting enough to warrant further investigation. The landscape around you is changing, though no one here will live long enough to notice. The climate is shifting gradually as the great ice sheets that covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere continue their slow retreat. More water is returning to the oceans. Sea levels are rising, though not in the dramatic day-after-tomorrow fashion that makes for exciting storytelling. Instead, they're climbing at a rate measured in inches per century, so slowly that 100 generations might live and die without anyone remarking on the change. But the water is coming. Somewhere to the south, beyond what is currently a 1,000-mile-long valley, the Indian Ocean is pressing against the narrow strait that will eventually become the Strait of Hormuz. Not yet, though. Not for thousands of years yet. Right now, that southern end of the valley is still dry land, still home to its own settlements and river systems, and people who have no idea they're living in what will become a shipping lane. You stand and stretch, feeling the heat on your skin, breathing air that hasn't been altered by industrial processes or fossil fuel combustion. The sky overhead is a blue so intense it almost hurts to look at, unmarked by contrails or pollution, or any evidence of the civilization that will eventually claim this region. A hawk circles high above, riding thermals with the casual mastery of a creature that has evolved for exactly this environment. You wonder if its descendants will adapt to coastal life when the water arrives, or if they'll simply move inland, following the familiar landscapes as they retreat before the advancing sea. The woman with the shell basket has finished her sorting and is now stringing the larger specimens onto a cord made from twisted plant fibre. These will become currency of a sort, traded with other settlements for obsidian or good flint or whatever commodities you can't produce yourself when your entire economy runs on barter and interpersonal relationships. She works with the focused attention of someone performing a task that matters, even though to outside eyes it might seem like she's just playing with shells. A commotion near the well draws your attention. Two children are arguing about something with the passionate intensity that children bring to disputes that adults can't even comprehend as worthy of conflict. An older boy intervenes, settling the matter with what appears to be a combination of logic and the threat of telling someone's mother. The defeated child, you can't tell if it's a boy or girl from this distance, stalks off with wounded dignity, while the victor returns to the pebble-throwing game with the satisfaction of someone who has defended an important principle. The settlement's rhythms are becoming clearer to you now. Morning is for water hauling and tool making and preparing for the day's necessary labours. Afternoon will drive everyone into whatever shade they can find, a forced siesta dictated by temperatures that make physical exertion genuinely dangerous. Evening will bring renewed activity, cooler air, and whatever social interactions pass for entertainment in a world without screens or books or anything except other people and the landscape's subtle dramas. You realise you're watching the beginnings of civilization, not the version with writing and cities and centralised government, but the deeper foundation. These people are solving the same basic problems that every human community must solve. How to get food, how to stay safe, how to pass knowledge to the next generation, and how to maintain social bonds that make cooperation possible. They're doing it with stone tools and oral traditions, and an intimate knowledge of their environment that will be completely lost once the water covers everything. The river continues its patient work of carrying sediment toward the valley floor, building up layers that will eventually compress into rock, creating a geological record that future scientists will read like a book. Each flood leaves its signature in the sediment. Each dry season etches itself in the patterns of cracked mud. The story is being written in real time, though no one here can read it. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of the settlement. The rhythmic tapping of stone tool manufacture, the occasional laugh or shout from children playing, the rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation, the distant murmur of the river. These are the sounds of a world that's already disappearing, though it will take millennia for the transformation to complete itself. The water is coming, patient and inexorable, and these people's descendants will gradually adjust, moving their settlements, adapting their lives, and creating flood myths to explain why the world keeps getting smaller. You're walking upstream now, following the river into territory that fewer people frequent. The landscape here looks surprisingly similar to what you left behind. The same hardy vegetation, the same sun-blasted rocks, the same sense that water is the exception rather than the rule. But the river itself is different, younger somehow, less burdened by sediment. You can actually see the bottom in the shallower sections, where stones polished by centuries of current gleam like they've been lacquered. The river-valley system you're exploring isn't a single waterway but a network, a complex web of channels that braid and separate and rejoin, according to seasonal rhythms and the landscape's subtle topography. Some of these channels flow year-round, fed by springs and groundwater that surfaces through cracks in the underlying rock. Others are seasonal affairs, dry gullies for most of the year that transform into raging torrents when winter rains finally arrive. The people who live here know each channel intimately, know which ones are reliable and which ones are treacherous, and know where to find water even when the surface flow disappears. You encounter evidence of human activity about every mile or so. Not settlements exactly, but stopping points. Places where travellers have paused long enough to leave traces. Fire rings circled with stones. Scatters of worked flint where someone sat and manufactured tools while waiting out the heat of the day. Occasional caches of preserved food tucked into rock overhangs, marked with signs that probably mean this belongs to someone who will be very annoyed if you eat it. The valley functions as a highway, a trade route, and a lifeline connecting communities that might be separated by dozens or even hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. A natural spring emerges from the base of a limestone cliff, creating a small oasis that's almost shockingly green against the surrounding browns and tans. Date palms cluster here, their presence suggesting either incredible luck or human intervention at some point in the past. You suspect the latter. Someone probably carried seeds or young plants from another location, planting them here because they understood that reliable water plus edible fruit equals a strategic resource worth protecting. The spring itself produces perhaps 5 gallons per minute, forming a small pool before the overflow continues downslope to join the main river. The water is cool enough to make your teeth ache when you cup some in your hands and drink. It tastes slightly sweet, the product of limestone filtration, nothing like the muddy river water you sampled earlier. Small fish dart through the pool, minnows or something similar, their presence indicating that this spring has been flowing for long enough to develop its own ecosystem. Someone has arranged flat stones around the pool's edge, creating a more defined basin that prevents erosion and keeps the water clearer. It's maintenance that requires occasional renewal, suggesting this spot sees regular use despite its distance from permanent settlements. You imagine traders stopping here, grateful for water that doesn't need to be boiled or strained, exchanging news with whoever else happens to be passing through. It's a natural meeting point, the kind of location that accumulates stories and significance beyond its physical attributes. As you continue upstream, the river narrows and the current strengthens. You're entering the foothills now, where the valley floor gives way to broken terrain that's considerably harder to traverse. The vegetation changes too, becoming slightly denser, incorporating species that need more water than the valley floor can provide. You spot wild grapes clinging to a rocky outcrop, their presence suggesting that sometime in the next few months, this area will attract people willing to make the difficult journey for the chance to harvest fruit that doesn't require cultivation. The river has carved a small gorge through this section, creating rock walls perhaps 30 feet high on either side. The stone shows clear stratification, layers of sediment compressed over unimaginable spans of time, each band representing a different climate, a different world. You run your hand along the rock face and feel fossils beneath your fingers, the preserved remains of creatures that lived when this entire region rested beneath a shallow sea millions of years earlier. It's a reminder that the coming flood won't be the first time water has claimed this landscape, just the most recent. A cairn stands on a rocky promontory overlooking the gorge, stones stacked with deliberate care to create a marker visible from a considerable distance. These waypoints guide travellers through terrain that can be confusing even for people who know it well. This particular cairn might mark a good ford or a dangerous section to avoid, or simply serve as a counting point for tracking distance travelled. You notice that someone has recently added a fresh stone to the top, continuing a tradition that might stretch back centuries. The sound of the river echoes off the gorge walls, creating an acoustic environment that's almost musical. Different flow rates produce different tones, and you suspect someone familiar with this section could judge water levels by sound alone. During flood season, this gorge probably becomes impassable, a churning chaos of white water that would kill anyone foolish enough to attempt crossing. But right now it's peaceful, almost contemplative, the water moving with purpose but not urgency. You spot a family group working their way downstream along the opposite bank. They're carrying bundles that suggest they've been gathering something. Plant materials maybe, or materials for tool making. 2 adults and 3 children, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who know this terrain well enough to traverse it without constant attention to foot placement. The children range in age from perhaps 4 to 10, and even the youngest navigates the rocky bank with surprising confidence. No one acknowledges your presence across the water. You're simply another person travelling through a landscape that belongs to everyone and no one. Higher still, where the river emerges from truly mountainous terrain, you find evidence of more intensive human activity. Someone has constructed a series of small diversion channels, routing water into shallow basins where useful plants grow in neat rows. It's not quite agriculture. The plants are species that grow wild in this region, but it's not quite gathering either. Call it encouraged production, a middle ground between pure hunting and gathering and full-scale farming. The basins contain wild barley and several species you don't recognise, their roots drinking from water that would otherwise rush past without benefit to anyone. An elderly man tends these plantings, moving along the channels with a stick that he uses to clear debris and maintain water flow. He's thin in the way that suggests a lifetime of physical labour rather than malnutrition, his skin weathered to leather by decades of sun exposure. He glances at you with the polite disinterest of someone who sees occasional strangers and has learned they're usually neither threat nor opportunity. You wonder if he created these channels or inherited them from someone else, whether he's been working this same plot for years or was recently displaced from somewhere else. The mountain peaks visible in the distance still carry snow, though it's melting fast as spring progresses. This runoff feeds the river system, creating the seasonal variation that people downstream plan their entire lives around. Too little snow and the summer will be brutal, with water sources drying up early, forcing difficult decisions about whether to stay or move. Too much snow and the spring floods become dangerous, potentially destroying years of accumulated infrastructure and supplies. You realise you're standing at what amounts to the headwaters of civilization in this region, not because of any inherent superiority of the location, but because water flows downhill, and everything else flows from that basic fact. The communities downstream depend on what happens here, on the snow that falls and melts, on the springs that emerge from cracks in the rock, and on the complex hydrology that determines whether any given year will be one of plenty or privation. A thunderhead is building to the west, a towering column of clouds that promises afternoon rain. You watch it develop with the appreciation of someone who doesn't have to worry about whether their shelter will leak or their stored grain will get wet. The people here watch it differently, calculating whether the rain will bring benefit or damage, whether it signals the beginning of a larger weather pattern or stands alone. They're meteorologists without instruments, climate scientists working from observation, and accumulated knowledge rather than satellites and computer models. The old man working the channels has noticed the approaching storm too. He's moving faster now, securing things that might wash away, making sure his diversions are clear enough to handle increased flow without overtopping their banks. It's a dance he's probably performed hundreds of times, the choreography of someone who understands that nature provides both the resources and the challenges, often in the same package. You find shelter beneath an overhang as the first large drops begin to fall. The rain arrives with the enthusiasm of water that's been held in the sky too long, spattering against the rocks with sounds like someone throwing handfuls of gravel. The temperature drops noticeably, the air filling with the smell of wet dust, a scent that will later be analysed and explained and given the scientific name petrichor, but which right now is just the smell of rain doing rain things to dry ground. The river below begins to change colour almost immediately, the increased flow stirring up sediment that's been settled and patient. Within 20 minutes, the water has gone from brown to the kind of reddish-brown that suggests serious erosion happening somewhere upstream. Small channels that were dry minutes ago now carry enthusiastic streams, all of them finding their way to the main river with the inevitability of gravity. You watch the water rise, not dramatically but noticeably, gaining perhaps an inch in the half hour you sit beneath the overhang. It's a small preview of the transformation this entire valley will undergo over the coming millennia, the gradual accumulation of water that will eventually turn a river valley into a seaway. Of course the mechanism will be different, rising seas rather than rainfall, and the timescale will be vastly longer, but the basic principle remains the same. Water goes where physics tells it to go, and everything else has to adapt or drown. The rain passes as quickly as it arrived, the storm cell moving eastward to drench someone else's landscape. The sun emerges, turning the wet rocks into a field of small mirrors, each surface reflecting light in a way that makes the entire landscape seem to shimmer. Steam rises from the hotter surfaces as water evaporates with the urgency of a liquid that knows it won't last long in this climate. The old man returns to his channels, checking for damage, clearing new debris deposited by the brief flood. He works without apparent frustration, treating this as just another task in a lifetime of tasks, necessary maintenance in a world that requires constant attention. You wonder what will happen to these carefully maintained diversions when he's gone, whether someone else will take over the work or if the channels will gradually fill with sediment and disappear, their existence eventually forgotten by everyone except archaeologists puzzling over geometric depressions beneath the seafloor. You're back in the valley floor now, but time has shifted forward several generations. The settlement you visited earlier has grown, or perhaps this is a different community altogether. It's genuinely difficult to tell when architecture consists of variations on the theme of stones arranged in circles. What's undeniable is that there are more people, more structures, and a sense of slightly greater permanence. Some dwellings now have stone walls that reach chest height, before giving way to organic roofing materials. Someone has invested effort in creating a communal space, a roughly circular clearing with fire-worn stones that suggest regular gatherings. The climate is changing, though asking anyone here about climate change would earn you the kind of blank stare reserved for nonsensical questions. As far as the inhabitants are concerned, weather varies from year to year in ways that have always varied, and always will vary. Some winters are wet, some are dry. Some summers are brutal, others are merely unpleasant. The river rises and falls according to patterns that generally make sense but occasionally surprise everyone. This is simply how the world works. What they don't notice, what they can't notice given the timescales involved, is that the average is shifting. The wettest years are slightly wetter than they used to be. The river's base flow is marginally higher. Springs that occasionally dried up now run year-round. The changes are subtle enough that no individual could detect them across their lifespan, but they're real, documented in the geological record that's accumulating beneath everyone's feet. An old woman sits near the communal fire pit, working on what appears to be a basket but might be a trap or a storage container, or any of a dozen other things that woven reeds can become in practiced hands. She's surrounded by children of various ages, and you realise you're witnessing a lesson. Knowledge being transmitted from one generation to the next through the ancient technology of showing someone how to do something until they can do it themselves. The children's attention waxes and wanes in the way that children's attention always does, but the old woman doesn't seem bothered. She continues her demonstration, narrating in a language you can't understand but whose cadence suggests she's done this many times before. One girl, perhaps 9 years old, shows particular aptitude, her fingers mimicking the old woman's motions with increasing confidence. Another child, a boy of similar age, seems to be attending more out of social obligation than genuine interest, his eyes constantly drifting toward where older boys are practicing with throwing spears. You notice subtle evidence of technological progress scattered throughout the settlement. Someone has discovered that certain clays, when heated, become water resistant, and several crude ceramic vessels sit near one dwelling, representing an innovation that will revolutionize food storage and preparation. The pottery is rough, thick-walled, and barely fit for purpose, but it's pottery, and it represents a conceptual breakthrough that will ripple through this culture over the coming generations. A group of adults is engaged in what looks like community planning, though it's really just people standing around pointing at things and presumably arguing about what should happen next. They're focused on an area near the well, where someone wants to build something, you can't tell what, and others apparently have opinions about whether this is a good idea. It's democracy at its most basic, consensus building through discussion, and probably some level of social pressure that wouldn't translate well to modern sensibilities. The resolution appears to involve compromise, what a surprise, and work begins on what reveals itself to be an expanded water storage system. Several people start digging a shallow basin adjacent to the existing well, lining it with stones brought from the river. The labour is divided along lines that might be gender or age or simply who's good at what tasks. Some people dig, some people carry stones, and some people fit the stones together with a precision that suggests either natural talent or extensive practice. You watch this construction project with the knowledge that it's ultimately futile. Not in the immediate sense, this water storage will serve the community well for generations, but in the longer term. In a few thousand years, this entire settlement will rest beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, all this careful labour transformed into a geometric anomaly that will briefly confuse marine archaeologists before they move on to more interesting findings. But that knowledge doesn't make the work less meaningful to the people doing it. They're solving the problems in front of them with the tools they have available, building infrastructure that will serve their grandchildren even if it won't survive their great-great-great-grandchildren. That seems to be enough. A child brings you water in one of the new ceramic vessels, offering it with shy formality that suggests adults have been coaching appropriate behaviour around strangers. The water tastes slightly of clay, an earthy undertone that isn't unpleasant but definitely noticeable. You drink it gratefully, aware that the child is watching for your reaction with the intensity of someone who's been told this is an important responsibility. You smile and nod, and the child scampers off with the satisfaction of a task successfully completed. The afternoon heat is building, and activity throughout the settlement is winding down in response. People retreat into whatever shade they can find or create, settling into the drowsy stillness that hot climates impose on sensible people. A few dogs, they're definitely dogs now, not wolf-adjacent creatures of questionable allegiance, sprawl in patches of shade, panting heavily, too hot to even investigate interesting smells. You find your own shade beneath one of the tamarisk trees that someone has encouraged to grow near the settlement. From here, you can see the entire community, such as it is, spread out in what passes for an organised layout. There's a logic to the arrangement that becomes clearer the longer you study it. Dwellings cluster in family groups, with clear spaces between clusters that probably represent social boundaries as much as physical ones. The communal areas, the well, the fire pit, and the new water storage project, occupy central locations accessible to everyone. The river is visible in the middle distance, a brown ribbon cutting through the landscape. You can see where people have worn paths to the water, multiple routes suggesting different purposes or preferences. One path leads to where women typically do washing and water collection. Another angle toward better fishing spots. A third approaches an easier ford that's probably used for crossing to the opposite bank. Clouds are building again, the same afternoon pattern you witnessed upstream. These storms seem to be becoming more frequent, or maybe you're just noticing them more. Either way, they represent a shift in the regional climate that's happening too gradually for anyone to document, but that's nevertheless real and consequential. More rain means more water in the river system, which means gradual changes to where and how people can live. The storm approaches but doesn't quite arrive, the rain falling in visible curtains perhaps a mile away while you remain dry beneath your tamarisk tree. You can smell it though. that distinctive scent of rain on the wind, and watch as people throughout the settlement glance skyward, calculating odds, deciding whether to secure things or wait and see. A young couple walks past your tree, their body language suggesting they're looking for privacy, which is apparently difficult to find in a community where everyone lives within shouting distance of everyone else. They settle on a spot perhaps 50 yards away, far enough to feel separate but close enough that you could probably hear their conversation if you were inclined to eavesdrop, which you're not because that would be weird and also none of your business. The settlement's dogs suddenly become alert, their collective attention focused on something beyond the perimeter that you can't see from your position. Several adults notice and respond, moving to investigate whatever has caught the dog's interest. You watch as they confer, pointing toward the southern approach, eventually relaxing in a way that suggests recognised friends rather than unknown threats. A small group appears, travellers from another community based on the goods they're carrying. They're welcomed with what looks like genuine pleasure, people emerging from their heat-induced stupor to greet the newcomers, exchange news and inspect trade goods. It's a reminder that these settlements exist in networks, connected by regular travel and exchange, even across distances that would seem prohibitive to people accustomed to motorised transportation. The visitors have brought obsidian, you notice, chunks of volcanic glass that originated somewhere far to the north or east, and passed through who knows how many hands before arriving here. In exchange, they're receiving baskets, dried fish, and what appear to be finished leather goods. The exchange rates are negotiated through processes you can't follow, involving lots of discussion and occasional laughter, and what might be ritual elements, or might just be people being theatrical about commerce. As evening approaches, the temperature finally begins to moderate, dropping from, "Why did anyone think living here was a good idea?" to merely, "This is pretty uncomfortable." Activity throughout the settlement increases correspondingly. Fires are lit for cooking. Children emerge from wherever they've been avoiding the heat, resuming their eternal mission of being loud about everything. The visitors are being fed, with preparations for a communal meal underway that will probably extend long into the night. You realise you're watching the construction of social bonds that will become cultural memory, stories told and retold until they transform into something between history and myth. Someone from this settlement will eventually marry someone from the visiting group, creating kinship ties that obligate mutual support. Knowledge will be exchanged, where to find good flint, which plants have medicinal properties, and warnings about dangers encountered while travelling. The networks that sustain human communities in environments like this are built one interaction at a time through hospitality and trade and the simple act of sharing news around a fire. The fire has burned down to coals and someone is telling a story. You can't understand the words, but the cadence is familiar, the rhythm of a narrative that's been polished through countless retellings. The listeners respond at appropriate moments with laughter or solemn attention, or ritual phrases that might be the equivalent of "Amen," or "That's right," or "Tell it." This is entertainment, yes, but it's also education, history and cultural transmission all wrapped together in the oldest technology humans have for preserving knowledge across generations. The story seems to involve water, based on the gestures the storyteller makes, sweeping motions that might represent floods, cupped hands suggesting scarcity, and flowing movements indicating rivers. You suspect it's an origin story, explaining how the river came to follow its current path, or why the seasons change, or some other fundamental fact about the world that deserves explanation even if the explanation isn't technically accurate. An older child interrupts with a question, and the storyteller responds with what sounds like patient clarification, then continues the narrative. This is interactive storytelling, permitting questions and discussion, very different from the passive consumption of stories that future generations will experience through books and screens. The audience participates in creating the performance, their reactions shaping how the storyteller emphasizes different elements. You notice that the visiting traders are paying particular attention, occasionally exchanging glances that suggest they're hearing variations of stories they know from their own community. This is how stories spread, mutating slightly with each retelling, accumulating local details while maintaining core narrative elements. In a few hundred years, communities across this entire valley system will share flood myths that describe water swallowing the world, and scholars will eventually argue about whether these represent actual memories of post-glacial sea level rise or are purely symbolic. The answer, as usual, will probably be both. The story concludes with what sounds like a moral or lesson, prompting approving murmurs from the adults present. The children are released from paying attention and immediately resume whatever they were doing before story time commanded their focus. Some of the adults drift toward their dwellings, the day's labours finally complete. Others remain by the fire, talking in small groups, probably discussing ordinary things: who's planning to marry whom, whether someone's cough sounds serious, and the quality of this season's fishing. You stand and stretch, walking to the settlement's edge where the manufactured landscape gives way to the wild. The stars are emerging now, so many that the sky looks crowded, with the Milky Way visible as a dense river of light cutting across the darkness. These people navigate by these stars, track seasons by them, and tell stories about them. The night sky is both a useful tool and a sacred text, read and interpreted by everyone capable of staying awake past sunset. A shooting star scratches across the darkness, and you hear exclamations from the people still gathered by the fire. Someone says something that provokes laughter, probably a joke about wishes or omens or whatever cultural significance shooting stars hold in this community. The moment passes, the conversations resume, and life continues in its patient progression toward morning. You realise that time is moving differently here, not because physics has changed, but because human experience of time is elastic, shaped by the pace of change in our surroundings. In an environment where seasons cycle but years blend together, where one generation's life differs only marginally from the previous generation's, time becomes less linear and more cyclical. The past isn't clearly separated from the present because the present looks so much like the past. But the changes are accumulating, invisible to individuals but visible across generations. The river is slowly rising. The climate is slowly shifting. The distance to the sea, though no one here has ever seen the sea, is slowly shrinking as ocean levels climb millimetre by millimetre, century after century. The valley that seems eternal is actually temporary, already in the process of transforming into something completely different. A night bird calls from somewhere near the river, a sound that's probably territorial claiming or mate-seeking, but that could just as easily be the bird expressing opinions about the day's events. Another bird answers from a different direction, and for a moment you're witnessing a conversation in a language you'll never understand, between creatures that probably have more sophisticated thoughts than they're generally given credit for. The moon rises, nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows. People move through the settlement using moonlight for illumination, no one bothering with torches for simple tasks like visiting the latrine area, or checking on children who should be asleep but probably aren't. The dogs resettle themselves, finding new patches of ground that haven't yet absorbed their body heat, comfortable in the knowledge that their humans are nearby, and the night holds no immediate threats worth barking about. You find yourself wondering what these people would think if you could show them the future. Not the distant future of cities and technology, but the comparatively near future when their valley becomes a gulf, when their river mouths become harbours, when the landscape they know as solid ground becomes a seafloor supporting ecosystems they've never imagined. Would they believe you? Would it matter to them, given that the transformation will take so long that their great-great-grandchildren's great-great-grandchildren will still be adapting to changes that feel gradual rather than catastrophic? A woman emerges from a dwelling carrying a crying infant, walking with the practiced motion of someone who's soothed many babies through many nights. She paces near the dying fire, bouncing gently, murmuring words that probably combine comfort and mild frustration in the universal language of parents who need their child to please go to sleep. The baby's cries gradually subside into hiccuping whimpers, then silence. The woman continues pacing for a few more minutes, making sure the sleep has truly taken hold, before disappearing back into her dwelling, with the caution of someone who knows that creaky floorboards exist specifically to wake babies at inopportune moments. The settlement settles into deep night quiet, the kind of silence that only exists far from cities and highways and all the ambient noise of modern civilization. You can hear the river if you listen carefully, a distant murmur that never quite stops. Occasionally a dog shifts position with a jingle of whatever passes for a collar in this era. Someone snores with the enthusiasm of a person who's done physical labour all day and has no reason to sleep apologetically. You close your eyes and try to imagine this same spot millennia from now, when researchers in submarines will explore these ruins, shining lights through water that's replaced air, documenting artifacts that speak to lives lived when breathing didn't require scuba equipment. The stone walls will still be here, probably, enduring, because stone does that. The organic materials, the wood, the leather, the woven baskets, will have long since degraded, leaving only shadows in the sediment where they once existed. You're walking along the river again, but decades have passed, maybe a full human lifetime. The settlement you knew has expanded significantly, or perhaps several settlements have grown close enough to begin functioning as a single entity. The stone structures are more substantial now, some reaching full human height before the roof materials take over. Someone has figured out that mixing mud with straw creates a useful building material, and several walls show this innovation, their surfaces smoothed with practiced hands. The river itself is different in ways that would be subtle if you hadn't seen it before. The bank has retreated slightly, the water claiming land that used to be dry, not dramatically, perhaps 10 feet over the decades you've been away, but noticeably once you know to look. The people living here probably attribute it to normal variation, unusual rainfall, or the river being in one of its periodic moods. They're adjusting their infrastructure accordingly, moving wells slightly inland and rebuilding structures that sat too close to the water's edge. You find evidence of this adaptation everywhere. The original well you saw is still in use, but someone has constructed a second one, positioned on higher ground. Several dwellings show signs of recent relocation and new construction on sites that offer better protection from flooding. A stone wall runs along part of the riverbank, not tall enough to prevent serious flooding, but sufficient to provide warning and buy time for moving valuable possessions to higher ground. An elderly man is directing younger workers in the maintenance of this wall, pointing out sections where stones have shifted or need replacing, or where the wall should be extended. His hands move with the authority of someone who's earned the right to give orders through demonstrated competence rather than imposed hierarchy. The workers respond with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but they respond, suggesting this man's knowledge is valued even if his personality might be occasionally difficult. You notice something interesting about the settlement's layout. There's a clear demarcation between older structures close to the river and newer construction at higher elevations. It's not a conscious planned response to rising water. These people don't think in those terms, but rather a practical adaptation to observed patterns. Floods have been getting more frequent, so new building happens where floods don't reach. Simple cause and effect, no theoretical framework required. A group of children plays in the shallows where the river has created a gentle backwater, their laughter carrying across the settlement. They're practicing swimming, or at least staying afloat, skills that previous generations probably didn't prioritise but that are becoming more important as water becomes more prevalent in daily life. An adult watches from the bank, ready to intervene if anyone gets into trouble, casual supervision that suggests this is normal activity rather than anything risky. The communal area has evolved too. What was once a simple fire pit has become something more elaborate. A permanent hearth with stones arranged to create multiple cooking surfaces, surrounded by flat rocks that serve as seating. Someone has created shade structures using wooden frames and woven mats, providing relief from the sun during the day and gathering spaces that encourage social interaction. The whole arrangement suggests a community that expects to be here for a while, investing in infrastructure that will serve multiple generations. You spot the old woman who was teaching basket weaving, or perhaps it's her daughter or granddaughter. At this remove, it's genuinely difficult to tell. She's engaged in the same activity, surrounded by children in various stages of paying attention. The eternal cycle of knowledge transmission continuing regardless of individual participants. One girl shows the same aptitude you saw decades ago, her fingers moving with confidence, and you wonder if she's a descendant of that earlier skilled child, or if manual dexterity just runs strong in this community. Trade goods are more varied now, suggesting expanded networks or more frequent contact with distant groups. You see items that clearly originated far away, shells from what must be the Mediterranean, copper that probably came from Anatolia, and stones with unusual properties that suggest volcanic origins. These objects represent not just commerce but relationships, the social bonds that make trade possible across distances that would take weeks to traverse on foot. The river valley itself is showing signs of gradual transformation. Areas that were dry scrubland in the past now support denser vegetation, with plants that need reliable water thriving in conditions that support them. Birds you didn't see before are now common, with species that prefer wetland environments taking advantage of the expanded aquatic habitat. The ecology is shifting in response to changing conditions, though again, no single generation would notice the transformation. An argument breaks out near the communal hearth, voices raised in the universal tone of people who fundamentally disagree about something important. You can't understand the specific issue, but the body language suggests it's related to resource allocation. Who gets to use which fishing spots perhaps, or whether certain areas should be reserved for gathering rather than allowed for general use. Several elders intervene, not with authority imposed from above but through facilitation, helping the disputants find compromise without anyone losing face. The resolution involves everyone walking to the river to look at something, gesturing at water levels and landmarks, and eventually nodding in apparent agreement. It's conflict resolution at its most basic. Look at the actual situation together, discuss what's reasonable, and find a solution that everyone can live with even if nobody's completely satisfied. It works, in its way, as evidenced by the fact that this community has persisted across generations without apparently tearing itself apart over disputes. You realise you're watching the development of governance structures, though calling them structures might be too formal. These are the proto-institutions that will eventually evolve into more complex social organisations, but right now they're just people figuring out how to live together without constant conflict. The rules are mostly unwritten, enforced through social pressure and accumulated tradition rather than any formal legal code. A young mother sits in the shade nursing an infant, simultaneously supervising two older children who are engaged in the eternal childhood activity of turning ordinary objects into toys. They've found some clay from the riverbank and are moulding it into shapes that might be animals or might be abstract sculptures or might just be clay that feels good to squish. The mother watches them with the expression of someone who's seen this particular show many times before but still finds it moderately entertaining. The day progresses toward afternoon, and you notice that the rhythm of activity has adjusted to accommodate more water in the immediate environment. Morning tasks now include checking for overnight flooding, a concern that apparently wasn't pressing in earlier generations. Several people are working on a raised platform near the river, creating a structure that will keep stored goods above potential flood levels. It's adaptation in real time, practical responses to observed problems. You walk to the higher ground where the newest construction is happening and turn to look back at the settlement. From this vantage point, the community's relationship with water becomes even more apparent. The river dominates the view, broader than you remember, its presence more commanding. The settlement arranges itself in relation to this water, with structures and paths and activity all oriented toward the source of life, even as everyone's simultaneously wary of its potential for destruction. Clouds build in the familiar afternoon pattern, and you realise these storms are definitely more frequent now. What was occasional in the past is becoming regular, the shift in precipitation patterns clear to anyone paying attention across decades rather than years. The people here aren't paying attention across decades, though. They're living their individual lives, responding to immediate conditions, and making the best decisions they can with the information available. The rain arrives, and everyone responds with practiced efficiency. Goods are moved under cover, children are herded into dwellings, and fires are protected or abandoned depending on their importance. It's not panic, just a practiced response to a familiar challenge. The rain itself seems heavier than you remember, fat drops that hit with enough force to splash mud, the kind of precipitation that suggests the atmosphere is holding more moisture than it used to. You find shelter in one of the newer structures, more sophisticated than the earlier buildings, with walls that actually repel water rather than merely slowing its entrance. The roof is properly thatched, with overlapping layers of dried vegetation that shed rain with impressive efficiency. Someone has figured out principles of water resistance through trial and error, knowledge now applied across the community. From inside, you listen to the rain drum against the roof, watch water stream past the entrance, and observe how the ground outside becomes increasingly saturated. This particular storm doesn't cause flooding, but you can see how a few more inches of rain would start to threaten lower-lying structures. The margin of safety is narrowing, the buffer between normal weather and disaster gradually shrinking as water becomes more prevalent throughout the landscape. When the rain passes, you emerge to find the settlement transformed into a network of puddles and streams, temporary watercourses that will drain away over the next few hours, but that currently make navigation challenging. Children immediately treat this as an entertainment opportunity, splashing through the water with delight that adults probably don't share. A few dogs join in, because of course they do, ending up muddy and pleased with themselves. The river has risen noticeably, even from this single storm. It's not threatening yet, but it's louder and more present, the sound of increased flow audible even at a distance. You watch as several adults walk to the bank to assess the situation, pointing at landmarks, discussing what this means for the coming days. If the rain continues, they'll need to move more goods to higher ground and possibly evacuate some structures temporarily. This is life in a changing climate, though nobody's using those words. This is adaptation, resilience, and community response to environmental conditions that are shifting just fast enough to require attention, but not so fast that traditional coping mechanisms fail completely. Yet. You're travelling with a group of traders now, people who specialise in moving goods between communities scattered across the valley system. They're tough, in the way that people who spend most of their lives walking are tough. Their bodies lean and efficient, their feet so calloused they barely bother with sandals. The group consists of 6 adults and 2 adolescents who are apparently learning the trade, experiencing firsthand the routes they'll eventually travel independently. The landscape they're traversing would have been entirely different a few generations ago. Where there used to be dry gullies, there are now seasonal streams that require fording with care. What were challenging but passable mudflats have become actual wetlands, complete with reeds and waterbirds and ground that sucks at your feet with every step. The traders know all of this intimately, adjusting their routes in response to changing conditions, finding new paths when old ones become impassable. You're crossing what used to be a reliable ford, but the water's higher now, reaching mid-thigh on the adults and nearly waist-high on the adolescents. Everyone's carrying their trade goods overhead, moving carefully to maintain balance on a river bottom that's slippery with algae and unclear through the brown water. One of the adolescents stumbles but catches themselves, earning a sharp comment from an older trader that probably translates to something like, "Pay attention before you drop everything we've carried for the last week." The opposite bank is muddy from recent flooding, making the exit from the river more challenging than the crossing itself. People haul themselves up using exposed tree roots, then turn to help those still in the water, the whole operation requiring cooperation and mutual support. Once everyone's safely across, there's a pause for reorganisation, checking that nothing got wet that shouldn't have, and redistributing loads that shifted during the crossing. You notice that the traders are carrying different goods than you saw in earlier times. There's less obsidian and more preserved fish, fewer stone tools, more ceramic vessels. The trade patterns are adapting to changing resource availability and shifting demand. Communities that used to specialise in one type of production have diversified or pivoted entirely, responding to market forces that nobody's theorising about but everyone's experiencing. The route follows higher ground now, avoiding areas that have become too wet for reliable passage. This adds distance to the journey, but eliminates the risk of getting stuck in mud or having to detour around unexpected flooding. The traders move with steady efficiency, maintaining a pace that covers ground without exhausting anyone. They're marathon runners, not sprinters, their entire strategy built around sustainable effort over multiple days. You pass evidence of abandoned settlements, structures that were built too close to water that's since claimed them. Stone walls emerge from shallow pools, their upper portions still visible above the waterline. Hearths that once centred family life now sit beneath inches of standing water, algae growing on stones that were selected for their heat retention properties. Nobody seems to find this remarkable. It's just how things are, the normal progression of a landscape where water keeps expanding its territory. A more active settlement appears in the distance, positioned on ground high enough to have avoided the flooding that claimed its neighbours. Smoke rises from multiple hearths, and you can see people moving around even from this distance. The traders increase their pace slightly, motivated by the prospect of reaching their destination, completing transactions, and resting before beginning the return journey. The settlement is larger than others you've seen, benefiting from its strategic position on high ground at a confluence of trade routes. Perhaps 50 structures cluster together, representing a population that might reach 200 people if you include children. This is approaching the upper limit of what this technology and social organisation can support. Any larger, and the community would probably split, with some group deciding to establish a daughter settlement elsewhere. The traders are greeted with genuine warmth, suggesting they're regular visitors whose arrival is anticipated. Children run out to meet them, excited by the prospect of new goods and stories from other communities. Adults emerge from dwellings and work areas, wiping hands on clothing, preparing to engage in the social rituals that surround trade. The actual trading happens in the communal area, with goods spread out on woven mats for inspection and discussion. This isn't silent commerce, there's extensive negotiation, people handling goods, asking questions and making counter-offers. The traders have stories about where each item came from, who made it, and what special properties it might have. These narratives add value, transforming simple objects into pieces of a larger world that most people in this settlement will never directly experience. You watch as a particularly fine ceramic vessel generates intense interest. It's larger and thinner walled than the local pottery, fired at higher temperatures based on its colour and hardness. The trader explains that it comes from a community 2 weeks' journey to the east, where someone has figured out kiln technology that achieves temperatures the local potters can't match. The asking price is high, multiple baskets of dried fish, some worked leather, and a quantity of that mysterious resource called future obligation. The negotiation takes hours, involving multiple community members who apparently have various claims to the resources being offered. There's no central authority deciding who gets what. Instead, there's extended discussion, occasional arguments, and eventual consensus. The process is inefficient by modern standards, but has the advantage of ensuring everyone feels heard and that agreements have broad support. While trading continues, the adolescent apprentices are getting a tour of the settlement from local young people. You follow along, observing how the hosts show off their community's achievements with obvious pride. They've got an impressive water storage system, multiple connected basins that collect runoff and provide a reserve supply during dry periods. Someone has figured out basic water purification using sand filters, a technological innovation that's reduced waterborne illness significantly. The local river system is more complex here, with multiple channels braiding through the landscape in patterns that change seasonally. The settlement has adapted to this by creating a network of bridges and fords, stone causeways that provide reliable passage even when water levels fluctuate. It represents massive labour investment and generations of work-building infrastructure that makes this location viable, despite challenging hydrology. You notice something else: the community's garbage disposal strategy. Middens are positioned carefully downslope from living areas, and there's clear attention to preventing contamination of water sources. This isn't modern sanitation engineering, but it's thoughtful waste management that reflects understanding of how disease spreads. The settlement is cleaner than others you've visited, and you suspect lower illness rates are one reason it's grown larger. As evening approaches, the traders are invited to share a communal meal, compensation for the goods they've brought, and incentive to return in the future. The meal is more elaborate than everyday fare. Fish grilled over open fires, some kind of grain porridge flavoured with herbs you don't recognise, and dates that must have come from one of those oasis settlements you passed earlier. It's festival food, a celebration of successful trade and continued relationships. The conversation during dinner is animated, with traders sharing news from other communities, locals asking questions about distant places, and everyone participating in the ancient human joy of gossip and storytelling. You learn that a settlement 3 days south has been completely abandoned due to flooding. Another community to the east is thriving, having found a reliable freshwater spring that's attracted additional families. Someone's daughter has married into a distant group, creating new kinship networks. A particularly skilled toolmaker has died, and his knowledge died with him because his children pursued different skills. These are the information networks that connect communities across vast distances long before any written records exist. News travels at walking pace, filtered through memory and interpretation, probably getting distorted in the process, but still serving to keep far-flung groups aware of each other's circumstances. It's how people know where to go during famines, which communities are accepting newcomers, and where resources might be available. After dinner, someone produces a musical instrument, a simple flute carved from bone, and begins playing. The melody is haunting, built on scales that don't quite match anything in your musical experience, but that work according to their own internal logic. Others join in, clapping rhythms, adding vocal harmonies, and creating sound that serves no practical purpose, but fulfills some deep human need for artistic expression. Children fall asleep where they sit, the day's excitement finally overwhelming their determination to stay awake. Adults continue talking long into the night. The traders are clearly valued not just for their goods, but for their role as information carriers, connecting isolated communities into something approaching a network. This is society at its most fundamental, people finding ways to cooperate and connect across distances, building relationships that transcend immediate family or local group. You realise that this network of trade and communication will adapt remarkably well to the coming changes. When the water rises enough to make land routes difficult, people will take to boats, maintaining connections across expanding water bodies. The settlements that survive will be those that adapt their trading practices to aquatic environments, that learn to navigate by coastal landmarks, and that figure out boat building and sail making and all the maritime technologies that will become necessary as the Gulf forms. The fire burns lower, conversations become quieter, and people drift towards sleep in whatever sheltered spaces they've claimed for the night. The traders bed down in a structure apparently reserved for visitors, the adolescent apprentices already snoring with the easy sleep of young people who've walked all day. You find your own sleeping spot and settle in, listening to the night sounds of a community at rest, knowing that tomorrow the traders will begin their return journey, carrying new goods and new stories back to the communities they came from. You're underwater now, or rather, you're observing what lies beneath modern waters, structures and artifacts that once existed in the dry air you've been breathing. This is the same location you've been visiting, but millennia have passed, and the sea has claimed everything. The transformation happened so gradually that it never felt catastrophic to the people experiencing it, just a series of adjustments that eventually added up to complete environmental change. The stone foundations you're seeing were built by people who never imagined they'd end up beneath the Persian Gulf. The walls are still there, arranged in patterns that clearly indicate human design, but they're covered in marine growth now, home to creatures that would have seemed alien to the original builders. Small fish dart through doorways that once framed human comings and goings. Seaweed waves in currents that follow the same basic patterns as the winds that used to blow across the valley floor. An archaeologist working from a research vessel has sent down a remotely operated vehicle, and you're watching through its cameras as it explores these ruins. The excitement in the control room is palpable. This is a significant finding, evidence of occupation in an area that wasn't supposed to have been habitable when these structures were built. Except it was habitable, obviously, because here are the buildings, here are the tools, and here are the undeniable traces of human life in a location that current models suggested should have been underwater at the time. The researchers are already revising their timelines, adjusting their understanding of when the Gulf flooded, how quickly the water rose, and what areas remained accessible longest. They're doing this based on radiocarbon dating of organic materials trapped in the sediment, correlating their findings with geological evidence from sediment cores and comparing notes with other research teams exploring different sections of the seafloor. They find a well, the same well you watched people dig and line with carefully selected stones thousands of years ago. It's still structurally sound, though filled with sediment now. The rope grooves you noticed were worn smooth by generations of use. The archaeologist directing the ROV lingers on this feature, clearly recognising it for what it is, probably already drafting the paper that will argue for earlier and more extensive human settlement in the Persian Gulf region than previously believed. More structures emerge from the sediment as the ROV continues its survey. The settlement you knew as a thriving community exists now as an underwater archaeological site. Every stone wall and hearth and storage pit transformed into data points in someone's dissertation. The researchers catalogue everything with painstaking care, creating digital models that will allow them to reconstruct the settlement's layout, estimate population, and theorise about social organisation and economic activities. They find ceramics, or rather ceramic fragments, sherds that once belonged to the vessels you watched people making and using and trading. The pottery has survived remarkably well, protected by sediment that covered it quickly enough to prevent complete dissolution, but gently enough that pieces remained largely intact. Someone will spend months analysing these sherds, categorising them by style and manufacturing technique, and using them to argue about trade networks and cultural connections between distant communities. The ROV's manipulator arm carefully retrieves a particularly intact piece, part of a large storage vessel that still shows finger marks from the potter who shaped it. You remember watching someone make pottery in this settlement, their hands moving with practiced confidence, creating containers that would store grain and water and oil. Those hands are bones now, long since returned to the cycle of elements, but their work persists, transformed into archaeological evidence of lives that mattered to the people living them, even if they were ultimately forgotten by everyone who came after. A heated discussion breaks out in the control room. Some researchers argue these structures prove permanent settlement in areas previously thought too marginal. Others suggest they might represent seasonal occupation, people using the area during periods of lower water levels. A third faction thinks the whole thing requires fundamentally rethinking the timeline of human habitation in the Gulf region. They're all partially right, but none of them can access the complete picture you've witnessed. The gradual changes, the incremental adaptations, the way people simply lived their lives while the world slowly transformed around them. The ROV moves to a different section of the site, revealing what appears to be a communal area. The stones arranged in a circle could be a hearth, though the researchers debate this, some arguing it might be a structure foundation, or even a natural formation. You want to tell them it's definitely a hearth. You sat near it while people cooked and told stories and argued about resource allocation. But you can't. So instead you watch them carefully measure and photograph and sample, turning human experience into quantifiable data. They discover something unexpected, a layer of shells that doesn't fit the regional pattern. These aren't local marine species, but freshwater mollusks, exactly like the ones you saw people collecting and sorting and stringing into trade goods. The researchers puzzle over this, eventually theorising that the site might have been occupied during a freshwater phase before marine conditions established themselves. They're right, though their timeline estimates are still off by several thousand years. The sediment around the structures tells its own story. Lower layers contain pollen from drought-adapted plants, suggesting arid conditions. Higher layers show an increasing presence of wetland species, documenting the gradual transition toward wetter conditions. The very top layers, just before marine sediments completely take over, contain evidence of extensive flooding. Not single catastrophic events, but repeated inundations that eventually made continued occupation impossible. You imagine the final generations who lived here, watching as the floods became more frequent. The water took longer to recede, and the intervals between floods grew shorter. They probably didn't think of it as their settlement being swallowed by the sea. The sea was still far away, over the horizon, a concept most of them had never directly experienced. They just knew that their traditional location was becoming less viable, that they needed to move to higher ground, and that the old stories about their ancestors living in this spot might need to become stories about finding a new spot. The researchers find evidence of this gradual abandonment in the archaeological record. The more portable, valuable items are missing, suggesting people had time to pack up and leave rather than fleeing from sudden disaster. The structures show signs of planned decommissioning, certain features carefully filled in, others left open in ways that suggest people intended to return but never did. It's the archaeology of orderly retreat, communities adapting to changing conditions in real time. A particularly exciting find emerges from beneath a collapsed wall. Carved stone, not functional tools but decorative or possibly ritual objects. The researchers can barely contain their enthusiasm. These are rare finds, the kind that make careers and fill museum displays and inspire popular documentaries about lost civilizations. They document every angle, take multiple samples for dating, and carefully retrieve the artifacts for further study. You recognize one of the carved stones. You saw it being worked on. Watch someone spend weeks chipping and grinding and polishing, creating something beautiful for reasons that probably made perfect sense to them, but that you never fully understood. Now it's a museum piece, an artifact that will be studied and theorized about and possibly misinterpreted by people who never met its creator, never understood the context that made it meaningful. The ROV's survey continues, revealing more of the settlement with each passing hour. The researchers are already planning return expeditions, more extensive excavations and detailed studies that will take years to complete. This site will become famous in archaeological circles as a key piece of evidence in understanding human adaptation to climate change, migration patterns in response to environmental shifts, and the resilience and ingenuity of early communities facing existential challenges. But for all their careful analysis and sophisticated techniques, the researchers will never fully grasp what you've witnessed. The lived experience of people who called this place home, who raised children and told stories and argued about fish trading rights and built wells, and hoped their grandchildren would benefit from their labour. The human dimension of archaeology is always somewhat inaccessible, reduced to inference and educated guessing based on material remains that can't fully convey what it meant to exist in a particular time and place. The submersible's lights illuminate a final section of the site, revealing what might have been the settlement's newest construction. Structures positioned on the highest available ground, built by people who understood that the water was coming and were trying to buy themselves a few more generations of occupation. The walls are more substantial here, clearly designed to resist flooding, incorporating lessons learned from watching earlier structures succumb to rising water. But eventually, even the highest ground wasn't high enough. The water won, the way water always wins given sufficient time. The settlement was abandoned, the structures slowly filled with sediment, the stories were forgotten or transformed into myths, and the physical evidence waited beneath the waves for researchers with submersibles and carbon dating to discover it and try to piece together what happened. You surface with the ROV, leaving the drowned settlement to its marine inhabitants. The research vessel rocks gently in the Gulf's shallow waters, and you reflect on the strange journey you've taken. From walking through a dry valley to swimming above the same locations, from watching people live their lives to watching researchers study the remains of those lives. It's a reminder that landscapes are temporary. Human occupation is always contingent on environmental conditions, and the only constant is change. You're standing on what will eventually become the Strait of Hormuz, but right now it's a narrow valley connecting two larger valleys, a bottleneck that constrains water flow during the wet season and serves as a convenient passage point during drier times. The landscape here is more dramatic than the river valleys you've been exploring. Steep rocky walls rise on either side, carved by millions of years of water action during periods when this region has been underwater in the deep geological past. A small community occupies a sheltered area where an underground spring emerges from the rock. The spring has been flowing for thousands of years, creating a reliable water source that makes human habitation possible in an otherwise harsh environment. People have built stone walls to channel the spring's output into usable pools, creating a small oasis that supports perhaps 30 people and attracts passing travellers who need to refill water containers before continuing their journeys. You notice that the community members here have a different appearance than the people you've been encountering in the main valley. Slightly different facial features, skin tones and body proportions. This suggests they represent a different migration stream. People who came from somewhere else and established themselves in this location because it offered the resources they needed. Trade goods scattered throughout the settlement include items from both the northern valleys and what must be southern regions beyond the current boundary of your travels. The strait itself is dry right now, a rocky passage that could be walked from one end to the other in perhaps half a day, but the stone walls on either side show clear evidence of water action, polishing, erosion patterns and deposits of materials that could only have been carried by flowing water. This place has been underwater before, in the distant past, and will be underwater again in the future, though the people living here have no way of knowing this. An older man gestures for you to follow him to a particular rock face, where someone long ago scratched marks that might be astronomical observations, or might be territorial claims, or might be art for art's sake. He explains something in his language, clearly proud of these marks, treating them as important cultural heritage. You study them carefully, noting how weathering has softened the lines, how lichen has colonized the protected crevices, and how these marks connect present inhabitants to ancestors who stood in this same spot centuries earlier. The spring produces perhaps 20 gallons per minute, enough to support the current population but not much more. You suspect this places a natural limit on community size. More people would strain the water supply, forcing some to leave or risk everyone suffering shortages. It's another example of how environmental factors shape human possibilities, creating constraints that determine social organisation without anyone consciously planning it. The settlement's trading role is evident in the variety of goods passing through. Shells from the Indian Ocean mix with minerals from mountain regions and plant materials from river valleys pile next to marine products from coastal areas you haven't visited. The people here serve as intermediaries, facilitating exchange between groups that never directly meet, taking a percentage of everything that passes through as payment for their services. You climb to a high point overlooking the strait and sit, trying to imagine what this place will look like when the ocean finally breaches the barrier to the south. The narrow valley will become a strategic waterway. The rocky walls that now provide shelter will become dangerous currents that require skilled navigation. The spring that currently sustains a small community will still flow, but it will empty into salt water, becoming a curiosity rather than a lifeline. The transformation will happen slowly enough that people will adapt. Settlements will shift from trade in portable goods to trade in maritime services, piloting, provisioning and ship repair. The knowledge that allowed people to survive in this harsh landscape will be replaced by knowledge of tides and currents and wind patterns. The continuity will be human presence, the human drive to find ways to thrive even in changing circumstances. As the sun sets, the temperature drops noticeably, the desert landscape giving up its heat with the same enthusiasm it absorbed it during the day. Stars emerge in stunning profusion, and someone points out constellations that apparently have names and stories, connecting the people in this small settlement to the larger universe in ways that are both practical and spiritual. You settle in for the night, listening to conversations you can't understand, watching stars wheel across the sky, and contemplating the enormous span of time that separates these people from you, and the even larger span that separates them from the researchers who will eventually explore their drowned settlements and try to piece together what their lives were like. Tomorrow the water will be fractionally higher, the changes fractionally more apparent, and the transformation of valley to gulf fractionally closer to completion. But tonight, this is still a dry strait, still a place where humans walk rather than sail, still a world on the verge of transformation that no single lifetime will witness in completion. The fire burns down to coals, conversations quiet, and sleep claims another day in the long, slow story of how a valley became a gulf, how dry land became seafloor, and how human communities adapted and survived and left traces that would puzzle researchers thousands of years later. The wind picks up slightly, carrying the faint smell of salt that suggests the ocean, though still distant, is nevertheless closer than it was yesterday. You close your eyes and drift towards sleep, your final thought being a question. In 10,000 years, what will researchers make of our drowned cities, our submerged infrastructure, and our traces left behind as the next transformation unfolds? The answer, like the future itself, remains unwritten, waiting to be discovered by curious minds not yet born.